Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Jessica Davis, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them.
In this episode, we'll discuss Good Friday, which this year falls on April 2nd. We do have some content notifications for you. Given that this is Good Friday, that maybe should not be a surprise. We discuss criminal injustice, police brutality, and state violence throughout the episode. During the deep dive, child abuse and indifference comes up. During our discussion on the Isaiah text, we discuss Christian antisemitism and supersessionism. During the John 18 verses 1 through 7 passage, we discuss lynching and the coup attempt in January and racist bigotry in mob mentality. During the John 18 verses 12 through 27 section, we discuss drugs and overdosing. During the John 19 verses 16b through 22, we discuss the Holocaust. And during the John 19 verses 31 through 42 and just the end of the episode, we discuss specifically COVID deaths and death in general.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
In today's episode, we're deep diving on Good Friday and the nature of sin with Jessica Davis, who is a church consultant, writer, editor, and speaker, specializing in Christian education, pastoral counseling, and diversity, equity, and inclusion training. She describes herself as an angry black woman in love with the gospel. So, Good Friday, 2 days before Easter Sunday, is the day on the church calendar when we remember Jesus' crucifixion and death after an unjust trial. It's the most solemn day in the church year. Jessica, as a church consultant, you've worked with a variety of Christians with different approaches to the faith. Some are probably pretty comfortable focusing on and talking about the themes and topics of Good Friday, death, sin, sacrifice, and so on. And some do their best to avoid these themes. So let's say you're starting to work with a new congregation and you find out that they are generally wildly uncomfortable addressing any of these topics. What does that tell you about them as a congregation?
Well, I want to start off by acknowledging that I think these topics are difficult for all of us to engage. Sure. Nobody really loves to think about their own mortality. Nobody really loves to think about their own sin. But when I go into a congregation and there's any one particular theological topic or there's any one particular life experience that I just get a brick wall, we don't talk about that. Unfortunately, that often points me to I need to do some examining of what that community's history is, because very often there's something in their history as a community that they don't talk about. And so because they can't talk about it, then that often manifests in whatever theological topics or whatever, just existential struggles are connected to that. We can't talk about that either. And so that's something where it depends on the time frame I have. If I'm with a community for a week, I'm not going to go there. I'll probably just, after I've been there, say, hey, this is something that I really think you might want to examine. But if I have more time, if I have a period of months, then we would start doing some really hardcore examining of who are we as a community? What is our history? What parts of our history are we proud of? Are we ashamed of? Do we keep secret? And sometimes those secrets are really hard to bring to light. But it has been my experience that until you deal with that, until you really do some digging deep into what has happened to this community and how did they deal with it, and very often that requires some significant trauma work, you can't get to, and now we're going to talk about your death. So yeah, that's definitely a red flag for me when I see that in a community.
Yeah, I had definitely noticed that if a community, not just a church, but any community, if they are, say, wildly uncomfortable talking about money, that usually means that something weird with money happened. And usually bad. But yeah. I hadn't really drawn that out to be also being true for other topics. So that totally makes sense.
Yeah, I wish it weren't, but that's definitely been my experience.
Part of my call process, one of the questions I always ask congregations is about their experience with conflict. And that is another one of those things that if they veer and they're like, oh, we all get along fine. It's like, not true. Never true. We're humans.
Yep. That's actually one of my first date questions and my first day at a congregation questions. I just realized that I asked that in both contexts. So how do you handle conflict? And if I don't like the answer, we're not going to have a second date. There's no point.
That's brilliant. I hadn't thought of it as a first date question, but that's a good one. Speaking of conflict, one of the themes of Good Friday within the realm of conflict and not conflict is sin. So sin can be understood as a broken relationship with God, with other people, or forces of evil that are at work in the world. I think a lot of people think that conflict is sin versus viewing it as just another part of life and humanity and humans being human. So I'm curious what you think about sin in today's world and where we notice it or where we don't notice it, or who notices sin in which ways.
Definitely. So I would say our conversations around sin are one of the ways in which my experience of the Black church and what I will call white church at the moment are pretty wildly different. In the Black church, sin is usually taken very seriously. There's never really any discussion of, oh, this doesn't exist. This might just be an idea or it's a metaphor. No, I mean, when you're in a community where literally your great-grandparents could have been slaves, there's no question that sin exists. There's no question that we do horrible, horrible things to one another. So for me, that's my starting point, is that absolutely sin is real. As far as where we experience it, I think that, it's every day, isn't it? It's a matter of degrees, but I can't think of a day where I didn't do something that was a sin. Even if I didn't interact with other people, I might have ordered something on Amazon that day, which is causing harm to folks. I might have, eaten strawberries that were picked by people that are, in near slavery conditions. We are so interconnected that I don't think a life free from sin is actually possible. What I try to focus on and help communities to focus on is getting better at noticing it, getting better at processing it, rather than getting caught up in that loop of, oh my God, I did a terrible thing, and then not moving beyond that. And then really trying to make intentional choices about, okay, where is my sin causing the most harm? And that's where I should probably start working to try and sin less.
Sure. Yeah, I had a conversation once a couple years ago with a colleague who was telling me the story of she showed up in a new congregation and she was stunned to find out that they really hated the hymn Amazing Grace. I have never met a Christian who hated the hymn Amazing Grace. Even if you're tired
Lots
of
of Black folks hate it, to be honest.
Acknowledge it's okay. And, and it turns out that the reason that congregation hated it was that they didn't want to admit they sinned. They didn't need grace. They were perfect already. And that was a whole ball of wax that turned into but
that feels like a very different way than...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the reason that lots of Black folks don't like it, and I do like it, but it's a really valid conversation around the idea that there's this person who caused tremendous harm to thousands of people, who one day realizes, oh, I did a bad thing, and I'm not going to do it anymore, but didn't really do anything to heal the harm he caused, and now we treat him as this example for, oh, well, this is how you're supposed to pursue repentance. That's not the repentance that I find in Scripture, and I don't really want to celebrate it. For me, I think that the other themes in the hymn make it okay for me, but I totally get the rationale for people that are like, no, I'm not singing that.
Yeah. I have to imagine it's an entirely different experience for white people singing it versus Black people.
As you were talking, Jess, about the I may not interact with anybody, but I might order something from Amazon, it reminded me of The Good Place. And this is not a spoiler for folks who haven't seen past the first season, but the way that they figure out who goes to the good place or the bad place when they die is this point system. Part of it is that it's so complicated that it used to be that if you bought a tomato and brought it to your grandma, you would get positive points because you're bringing a tomato to your grandma. But now it's actually worth negative so many points because the person who picked it is not being treated fairly or justly, is not being paid adequately, and the carbon emissions from getting it from the farm to the grocery store and you from the grocery store to your grandma's. But it is like that those particular things of the individual choices we make and the way sin shows up that way is so different and so complex in a way that I don't think it always has been that complex. It's always been complex because we're interconnected, but we're just so much more interconnected and interdependent today.
Yeah, I definitely think that's so. Or at the very least that it's much more in our face. And I know that I have definite Chidi tendencies. For those who may not have seen it, Chidi is a character who gets paralyzed by indecision.
Yep.
And a lot of people wouldn't know that about me. I seem to be very decisive on the outside. On the inside, I'm a mess. I'm just a roiling cauldron of, oh my God, what should I do next? And I can really get caught up in this feedback loop of, okay, well, if I do X, I'm causing harm to Y. And if I do Y, I'm causing harm to Z. And, the only thing that's able to snap me out of it is the recognition that in doing that, I'm centering myself and not the people and the planet that I'm harming. And that's actually a really selfish position to be in. So usually that's able to help me like, hello, snap out of it. It's not all about you. But yeah, I get that. And I actually, probably a decade ago now, for my Lenten discipline, decided to try and cause the least suffering possible. So it meant, I had to spend hours researching everything I put in my mouth. All of the clothes that I wore were causing harm to the people and the planet. The car that I drove, but then if you take public transportation, there's consequences to that too. And I was just, putting myself in knots. But I am, in retrospect, glad that I attempted to do it because it helped me understand that a sinless life isn't possible. A life free from causing hurt and harm isn't possible. That really the best we can do is examine the choices that we're making. And, as much as we can, lean into wanting to honor God's creation and God's people.
And to be responsive when someone points out our sin, right? Like it's that flip side of leaning into honoring, but then also like when inevitably we do sin and someone says, hey, what you did was harmful or what you did was wrong, to then be like, oh, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm sorry. Here's a plan for like how I can do things differently or make up for it or.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we're not doing that, we're not honoring God's beloveds.
Think about that too, Jessica, with your work, particularly around reparations and that sense of like not only the individual things that we do, but the systems and structures that we're a part of and what it looks like to repent when it's a systemic thing or a structural thing. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more. I think we've talked about reparations some on the podcast, but not a ton.
Sure. A big part of my work these days is first educating white folks about reparations, and then second, actually collecting reparations. At this point, my work focuses on individual reparations. Though I educate about the systemic pieces, I don't have a ton of power in any real large organizations. But so I spend my time using the power that I do have, focusing on individuals and small communities, individual congregations. And the work that I do at present is mostly for Black people of marginalized gender who are in extreme crisis. I wish that weren't my work. I would love my work to be, helping people live into their fullest selves. But because the situation is so dire, the work that I do is often collecting reparations for people who are like, I got kicked out of my housing and I'm on the street and I have a kid and, those types of situations.
So on that note, Emily and I have talked with you about sin before, and one of the things that can confuse people when we're talking about sin is that it can exist both in an individual way and also in more of a systemic or structural way. So could you talk a bit about how you've witnessed and understood sin in the world in those ways?
Yeah, I think in the systemic sense, it's everything that we look at and go, that's wrong. Someone should do something about that. And it's my personal belief that little voice, that's God. That's God saying, you should do something about that.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those things that, whether it's housing and homelessness or healthcare or carbon emissions, but those things that we just look at and don't necessarily think to start with our part of it because it seems like such a big problem, and we just go, oh my goodness, someone should do something about that. That's how I encounter systemic sin. In the individual piece, I hesitate a little bit to get too specific about the types of sin that I've experienced, in the types of sin that the people I work with experience, simply because it's been my experience that when you're working with people who are sort of living in extremis, or you're in that position yourself where, you're homeless, you may be living with addiction, all of the things that come with homelessness, you're very likely to be sexually assaulted. Living through those things, especially multiple iterations of those things, often makes it so the only relationship you can have with people who haven't been through that is one of, "Aw, poor you." I have to be very careful when I'm in congregations about when I decide to let folks know that, I have spent a significant amount of time homeless and things of that nature.
Yeah.
And I really got clear on it when I was in seminary. And one of the things that I was doing was, while I was taking classes, I actually was working at a Lutheran institution that was a residential facility for children with behavioral disorders. And the vast majority of those children had been through just horrific abuse. And so I would go to congregations and preach and, lead forums and try to get people to donate money. And no one donated anything, like nothing, for the first 6 weeks. And I finally went to my mentor and was like, I don't understand what's happening. I know that people can be cruel, but like, these are little abused kids. Like, I would think that they would want to do something. And she, blunt as she always was like, they're not doing anything because of you. The problem is you. She explained to me that there is a level of suffering that makes people who haven't experienced it immediately just shut down. It's like flipping a switch. Because if we acknowledge the things that happen to these kids, then we have to start acknowledging our part in it. Is there something I should have done? Could it be happening to a child in my neighborhood? Could it be happening to a child in my family? And those things are so difficult to think about. It's much easier to just flip the switch and be like, oh, she must be lying. No one lives through, experience that horrible. And so it's been really interesting trying to navigate that and help folks name and look at sin on both a systemic and an individual level, and figuring out when and how to push, but not doing it in a way that makes them shut down. I often joke that my role in the body of Christ is a finger, and I really, really don't want to be a finger god. Could I please be anything but a finger? But it seems to be that, a key feature of my ministry. It always has been and always will be pointing at things and going, God told me to tell you to look at this. So yeah, wouldn't have been what I chose, but that's where I am.
Yeah, it's so important that both the like pointing towards things so that people see it, and the poking. Nope, I'm not going to let you just like sit and ignore and deny and whatever. I'm going to keep poking you. Poke and point.
Yes.
Poke and point. Yeah. So we have a lot of readings for our episode today. Just so folks know, the way we've kind of organized it is we'll do all of the readings, and we broke up the Gospel of John that is assigned for today into separate pieces, similar to what congregations would use if they're doing like a tenebrae service, which is a service of darkness where each passage is read and candles are slowly extinguished and lights are dimmed. So if you want to follow that pattern, this is a great way of doing it.
It makes the two very long chapters more digestible, you might think.
Yep, I grew up, our Lutheran congregation and the Episcopal congregation would do it together, and one of the pastors would read the gospel, and then there'd be a short homily, and then a song, and the lights would dim, and a next passage, short homily, song, lights dim. So it's a really beautiful way, I think, of being able to, as Kay said, digest the readings. But our first reading is Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13 through 53, verse 12. The final servant song of Isaiah tells us that God's servants' sacrifice of themselves for others has been successful and brings about forgiveness of sin. One of the themes that I noticed in this passage is the theme of suffering for the sake of others. And this comes with spoilers for the end of the Divergent series, which is an ending that I actually really despise, but is going to come up a bunch today. But this idea of choosing, right? It's important that this is a choice to take on this suffering, and that's not always how we think about suffering in general. But in Divergent, Tris, who is the most divergent of the divergents, Tris makes the choice to sacrifice herself for the sake of everyone else and the chance of her community and those she cares about to live and remember and keep trying to do better. And so she ends up dying, not even necessarily from the way that we anticipate when she chooses to sacrifice herself, but she does take on that suffering intentionally. And the reason I hate it is because the strong women almost always are killed in literature. And I just want strong women to live, even in fiction.
It's not complicated. Just don't kill them. You would think it wouldn't be that hard.
I also, as we dive into the verses, in verse 4, I was thinking about, as Isaiah says, surely they have borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. And that reminded me of the many times in Katniss in the Hunger Games, or Laia or Elias in Ember in the Ashes, but that seems like the feeling that the protagonists frequently have when they see other people suffering, right? When Katniss sees other people suffering, she takes it on as this is all because of me. And Elias really does it, but both Laia and Elias do that, where they're those people are suffering because of me, which doesn't really take into the equation the larger context that they're just in a situation that is awful, and any resistance to this oppressive situation is going to meet with greater suffering for some people. And I think that's an interesting way when we think about, especially when we think about sin, as you were talking about, Jessica, the big picture sins and what we can do about them, but also recognizing that within that, there will always be backlash. We're experiencing it now as a country, but there's always backlash, and it hits particularly vulnerable people the hardest. And so figuring out how to navigate and mediate that is a difficult thing, I think.
Pastor Emily, I think you're right. And I think that when we look at, a lot of the media that we consume, we have this very particular story of a hero who is looking to do the right thing and has this internal conflict about what that right or wrong thing is, and then discovers the answer was within them all along, right? And that they're called to suffer on behalf of other people. To me, that is a really bad retelling of the Jesus story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of history behind why we're sort of obsessed with that story. But the part that's missing in that conversation or those stories is the idea that Jesus was supposed to be the last person to have to do this, that Jesus was supposed to end that cycle. And so it's always interesting to me when we cross the line from standing alongside others who are suffering and working to end their suffering, and this idea that I am a hero or a savior figure that can take their suffering into myself and sort of subsume it. That's not something I think humans were actually designed to do.
Right.
I also think it's really important for us to acknowledge the fact that this idea that the servant songs apply to Jesus is a very particularly Western Christian idea that's about 100 years old. For most of history, the idea was that this suffering servant was Israel. And so I think, I do hear resonances to Jesus, certainly in them. I think that Jesus probably heard resonances to himself in them. And also, I just want to caution us away from assuming that that's the only possible interpretation. And then if that is the correct, quote unquote, correct interpretation, then assuming that it applies not just to Jesus, but also to us, that we're supposed to be in this savior role.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's tricky about the way the Revised Common Lectionary, which we're following, is ordered, is that it pairs up all of these beautiful passages and all of these like really powerful stories and prophetic words that are about a particular time and place and people, and then says, and here they apply to Jesus, and look, they apply to Jesus. Like what you were saying, Jessica, that like that supersessionism is really harmful, and is particularly needs to be named by those of us who are Lutheran, because we come from Martin Luther, who was super anti-Semitic. And so to be able to like to name that and to say, we can resonate with pieces of this, but this is not written to be about Jesus.
Exactly. And I actually, my undergrad honors thesis was on Christian responses to the Holocaust, Christian communities in Germany, their responses to the Holocaust. I did a program of Holocaust and genocide studies. And one of the most interesting things that I found was that the idea that like we in the U.S. Lutheran Church have about Bonhoeffer is really, really damaged and not really reflective of who he was as a person or his ministry.
Mm-hmm.
He certainly made extraordinarily profound sacrifices for other people. He gave his life for other people. But here's the thing, he didn't believe those people deserved salvation, right? The reason that Bonhoeffer is not honored at Yad Vashem is because he was super anti-Semitic. He was super harmful to Jewish people in his theology. What made him, I suppose, unique from most of what was happening in the German church was that he at least acknowledged, hey, these are human beings. We probably shouldn't be slaughtering human beings. But we never want to own the fact that his theology, even to the, his very last writings, was really, really pretty terrible around our relationship to the Jewish people. And it's just, it saddens me how much we celebrate him in the Lutheran Church in the US, because I think that prevents us from having conversations around, hey, when we take this hero figure out of the equation, where does that leave us? What do we believe? What are we called to do?
Mm-hmm.
I've also had good conversations with people about Bonhoeffer, in that part of the reason we celebrate him is that he was so unusual. And we don't talk about the fact that his willingness to take such drastic action was so unusual, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like those heartwarming, inspirational stories about people who do extraordinary things for people who have nothing, when in fact it's not a heartwarming story, because the story is that these people have nothing and they really shouldn't.
Yeah.
So.
Exactly.
Relatedly, in verse 9, we read, "They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth." So with the parallel way that this verse is set up, it's essentially assuming that the wicked are violent and the rich are assumed to be deceitful. And that second part of what this verse is doing takes me immediately to Les Mis. I read the book when I was younger, but the movie that came out a handful of years ago of the musical was excellent, and I loved it. And one of the themes in that story is that anyone who is remotely well off or financially comfortable, or like not even rich, just like they don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from, with exactly one exception I can come up with in the book, who doesn't exist in the musical, who's a bishop. But anyone who is financially comfortable is actively hurting people who are less powerful than them. And very often they are also deceitful. Even the main character of the story, Jean Valjean, who is a fugitive and has been in poverty before, during the period where he is a respected town mayor and runs a factory, he allows Fantine's life to be completely destroyed due to a rumor, because he's rich and he doesn't understand the consequences of what he's doing. And he doesn't care enough to understand. And so this is what you might call a rather different view on the rich than what we have now as a American pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comparison. I adore Les Mis. When I was like 8 years old, I remember singing A Little Fall of Rain and being both Marius and Eponine and like laying on the floor dying and then standing up and like comforting myself as I was dying. I just, really fell in love with the musical as a child. But one thing I think that's really interesting is that the reason I loved it was that it allowed me to step into a world where I could be this sort of glamorous urchin. And I think that that's not uncommon for kids. As I got older, I realized that one of the reasons, or really the main reason, that I was so interested in Les Mis was that it allowed me to play act in this sort of glamorous urchin role that, is super harmful to people who are actually living in poverty. And, I always have to examine the book with the knowledge that for Victor Hugo, he was extraordinarily wealthy, and he was, for most of his life, living as part of a community that explored themes of poverty because it was de rigueur, right? Because it was just sort of a trend at the time, right? I think most of us have seen the movie or the stage version of Rent and know that that's a retelling of La Boheme. Mm. And this book is very much in that trend, right? We were looking at the suffering of poor people because it was fashionable. And it wasn't until later in his life when he actually started to participate in the abolitionist movement and really start risking his career over the death penalty that his philosophy started to change and that he suddenly had consequences and was exiled. So I think when we're looking at stories like this, especially if we're going to be connecting these stories to our theology, it's just super important for us to contextualize it.
Yeah. Our next reading for Good Friday is from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 16 through 25. The author reminds us that because of Jesus' sacrifice and the new covenant God has made with us, we can approach faith with assurance and without wavering.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage is a theme of kind of a new kind of faithfulness, a new way of being faithful. And it reminded me, I am just now starting the Graceling series again because a new book has come out. And so the beginning part kind of tells the story of Katza, who is the king's niece and has this special power, this grace to kill. It kind of explains how she found a new way of being faithful to herself that wasn't possible as she was working for the king, because he would send her to be his enforcer and she'd have to do it. But then she created this council that becomes this way of counteracting and challenging and protecting instead of bullying or hurting other people. And so there's just this like shift in how she works and how she finds purpose in her life when she starts to do something that she feels called to, that is faithful for her and not necessarily for the king.
Yeah. When we reach verse 16, we read, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their hearts, and I will write them on their minds." And this whole writing on their minds bit reminds me of how in the movie Jupiter Ascending, there are several characters who are genome engineered, is the word they use. Their DNA has been spliced with that of an animal to give them unusual characteristics or abilities. And there's a tradition that the splicer, the person who did the splicing, signs their work with something that sort of looks like an embossed tattoo. And it invites me to imagine God signing their work in us. How would the world be different if we could see God's signature on every person and part of creation that we interacted with?
I think that's a complicated question. I think today, in this moment, the idea of sort of having God's will or God's word in my DNA or in my bones, as Scripture often calls it, is comforting. If you had said that to me 20 years ago, it would have felt pretty horrifying because I wasn't a Christian at that time. And so this idea that, every person created has this non-consensual relationship with the divine makes me really, really uncomfortable. And so I guess with things like that of, God's will being written in us or on us, the way that I approach it is that the answers to life's existential questions are within us. And for me and, the community that I choose to worship with at this moment, that looks like God. But I'm not about to say that this is something, that this existence of God or relationship with God is something that necessarily applies to all of humanity.
Yeah. I like that way of thinking about it. It reminds me of Paul Tillich's understanding of God as the source and ground of all being, or our ultimate concern, and the different ways we can think about both God, but also think about like the ways that we're connected to each other and that we're called to something larger than ourselves.
I really like the idea of ultimate concern. I think so often when we're in spaces that we claim are multi-faith, they're not. They're Christian, and we don't use the word God. We'll even use things like God or whatever you choose to call that entity. No, that's not embracing the fact that not everyone is Christian and not everyone believes in God. Mm-hmm. But I think we do all share this ultimate concern that there are things beyond just ourselves that matter. And that for whatever reason, we're all here on the planet together, and that we are deeply interconnected. That resonates for me much more than, okay, we're going to talk about God, but we're just not going to use the word God.
Yeah.
As we continue in verse 23, we read, "Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for the one who has promised is faithful." And I was thinking about faithful promises, and there's some spoilers in this for the Ember and the Ashes series, which I just may never get over because it's just so good. But Cain, and I've talked about this before, that Cain promises Elias that if instead of deserting like he was planning to, he stays and follows this path, that he will get freedom of body and soul. And it happens eventually. It takes, 4 books to get there, but there are different points along the books where like Elias is trying to like logic his way into, oh, this is what he means by freedom of body, and this is what he means by freedom of soul, and the reality is that it's much, much later that it finally comes to pass. But that's I think one of the pieces of faith is that we trust and we hope and we hold fast to something that we don't yet know, that we don't yet experience fully, but it's still coming. And we're still waiting. We're still hoping.
Definitely. I'll be honest that I struggle with a lot of what happens in Hebrews, but this is something that I think really gets to the core of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about God. I'm often asked by people like, what is Lutheran? Why is Lutheran different than any other kind of Christian? Like, why does it matter to have denominations? And the easiest answer would be to talk about grace. But I think for me, the most accurate answer is that when we're at our best, everything we believe comes back to this certainty, when we're not certain about anything else, that if God exists, God keeps promises. And I think one of the sort of central conflicts that was happening when what would go on to become the Lutheran Church was being formed was that people were really suffering over their relationship with the Eucharist. There was this idea that God would become present in the Eucharist at the moment a bell rang, and that when you took the bread and wine, you were taking God and God's forgiveness into yourself. And people were so distressed by their sin that they literally were running around town from church to church to get there before the bell rang so that they could like take more forgiveness into themselves. And as goofy as it sounds, like I have friends that I think are doing that today. Like, they can never go out and do anything because it's like, well, I have to go to 4:00 Mass and I have to go to 7:00 Mass on Friday. Then I have Saturday morning Mass. Then I have Sunday evening Mass. And they never sound like they enjoy it. It's this, I'm so sinful. I have to go to church 9 times in a week to be forgiven. And I think that what Lutherans at least try to get at is this idea that God already forgave you. That when we read in scripture that our sins are as far from God's mind as the east is from the west, that God meant that. Like the work has already been done. So that creates this extraordinary freedom where rather than constantly focusing on ourselves and, oh, I'm such a horrible person, what do I need to do to make it better? We then get to focus on God created this incredible world. Like, what can I do to make it better? And I think that that's a little bit of what this Hebrews text is getting at.
That's beautiful.
The other option for our second reading for Good Friday is also from Hebrews, but it's Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, and chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. Because Jesus understands our weaknesses so well, he will be kind and humble in the role of high priest. So one of the themes that came out for me in this passage was the theme of bold confession. So in trusting Jesus to be kind and humble as high priest, there is this call to a bold confession, which actually reminded me, I just watched the other day this clip of Margaret Cho on Stephen Colbert, but talking about racism and comedy with him, and at some point he brings up like political correctness, and she has this great way of like flipping it on its head and to like point to the way that as political correctness kind of came into being more vernacular, more common language, that was also part of how white fragility and white women tears, those sorts of things come into play more for white people in talking about racism to not be held accountable. And she talks about it and she's like, yeah, I used to be able to just like go up on stage. And then she says like something that points to like racism in the world. And she's like, but now like I have to be more careful because everybody gets offended. But she's talking about like white people getting offended. And so there's this boldness that I think she in particular as a woman of color who's a comedian has within that interaction, but also is talking about in the different ways that we interact and the ways that particularly white people like shelter ourselves, where we're not bold in our confessions, we're not bold in our proclamations.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because I actually posted a clip from a different part of that same interview like 2 days ago on Facebook. And I literally just stumbled across it. It came up in my recommendations on YouTube. And I was like, oh, I haven't seen Margaret Cho in a while. Let me click on this. And what I took away from it was not just her boldness, but her extraordinary skill. I mean, she honestly reminded me of Paul's letters, because one of the things that happens in that interview is as Colbert is talking about white people being racist, he literally makes a joke about Asian people eating dogs, catches himself, like kind of does this weird chuckle. And then Margaret comes in, like loops immediately around and doesn't stop the interview and say, dude, that was super racist. What she does is she starts engaging this entire conversation about both the anti-Blackness that exists in the Asian community and what it is to be Asian, trying to relate to white people and constantly being discriminated against, even when white people think they aren't doing it, like nod to Stephen Colbert, and trying to figure out if they can use their proximity to whiteness and they can use anti-Blackness to put themselves in a position of power. And that she was able to turn that conversation that quickly and be funny and point out how racist he was being without pointing out how racist he was being is just some exceptional work to me. But I also recognize how exhausting that is.
Yeah.
It's just sort of a reality of life for those of us that are public figures that deal with mostly white folks, that you are always on. There is always someone in the room who is waiting for you to stumble, who's waiting for you to say something that's, the tiniest bit inaccurate, that there are people who are wanting to do the right thing, but are really hurt and defensive and angry, and that you're having to have conversations with all of those people at once. And you're constantly evaluating in every moment, how hard do I push? How hard, like, how much am I going to coddle folks? To what degree am I going to appeal to their emotions? And it's really tiring. And so I wonder, when we think about, being bold in our faith and in our communications, how do we build in this idea that being bold and charismatic is important, and at the same time is not the only value by which we judge people's worth, and by which we judge whether or not we're going to listen to people from vulnerable communities.
Yeah. Actually, Jessica, I think you are the one who shared the clip, and I think somehow I got like flipped into just a sliver of it instead of the full context, and then I couldn't find it again, and so I just caught like that one piece that was like towards the end, I think, and I was like, there was more to this, but then I couldn't remember. I could never remember like who posts things, and on Facebook it just gets buried by the time I like go back, and so I'm glad that we're having this conversation then, because then I'm like, oh yeah, it was Jessica. And it is like Margaret Cho is.
I am the queen of seeing something and being like, oh, I'm going to use that in a sermon later. I'll remember to go back and find it. And one, I don't remember. And two, if I do, like, I have no idea where I saw it. So I'm with you.
I love that I brought it up and then you were like, actually, yeah, anyway. As we dive into the passage, in verse 14 we read, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God." That made me think of all of the different people in our lives who become like personal priest, personal chaplain, or like I have several like people who are friends who are nurses, and so frequently I'm like, hey, I have this thing, what do you recommend? Or like a personal accountant, or like all of those different things. And there's like a problematic nature of those relationships.
Being both a nurse and a minister.
Right. Yeah. I imagine you get that a lot.
I do. And it's always very interesting, like being both a nurse and a minister. Like I can recognize the expression on someone's face that like, oh, I need to flip into professional mode now, but I'm never quite sure whether the question is going to be like, oh, I did this horrible thing, am I going to hell? Or I have this horrible thing on a part of my body.
Let me show you.
Yeah.
No, please don't.
So you have to be prepared for both eventualities.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I also hear that counselors and therapists get that a lot too. And sometimes those stories are pretty terrifying.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. I was trying to think of other ones and I was like, English teacher? I don't feel like I ask a lot of English teacher questions, but maybe.
Well, and I think it brings into the conversation the fields that we expect people to do for free all the time. You know, when I was in college, I was working in childcare in an elementary age childcare facility. And we had several families that were just always late, and not because like, oh, I was, got caught at work, because like, oh, I had a hair appointment, and there was this expectation of, well, you're a giver and you should want to care for my children all the time and you shouldn't ask for money. And it really doesn't matter if you have a family and children of your own that are waiting for you, you exist to serve us. And I've spent most of my life in servant type careers, whether it was childcare or nursing or the ministry. And it's always really interesting to me that, we have these types of jobs where we just sort of expect people to be on all the time, to be sacrificing all the time. And I'm not quite sure what the solution is, but I know that that's super unhealthy.
Yeah.
And it seems especially ironic, especially because these are people who have chosen this profession as what they want to take money for.
Right.
When you think about it.
I think it's particularly in Iowa right now, the amount of harm that has been done to teachers, to public teachers in Iowa, really, and across the country, I think, but Iowa has had some particularly terrible anti-union bills several years ago, and they just increased funding, which actually, because of decreased enrollment because of the pandemic, result in a severe drop in funding for public schools throughout the state. And And so like there's just the like reality of how little we pay teachers and compensate them, but then also the added pressure of how much we expect them to do above and beyond contract hours, above and beyond actual roles and responsibilities, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And we expect it to be for free.
Because they're heroes. Yeah. That's what heroes do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the church really is behind a great deal of those really broken expectations for people in helping professions. And it comes back to this this hero idea.
So I acknowledge that this next verse I'm going to talk about is technically that the lectionary chooses to skip. However, there's a pandemic. Limits are imaginary. And also I think that this concept applies to several verses in this passage, so I could have picked a different verse. I just didn't happen to do that this time. So I'm going to go with it anyway. In verse 4, in chapter 5, we read, "And one does not presume to take this honor of being high priest, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was." So I can't speak for the way that other church organizations do things, because I only belong to one. But the denomination I belong to, leaders in the organization, whether they are lay people or clergy, are elected to their positions, for the most part. And unlike political elections in our country, these are elections that you don't campaign for. Like, there is an unspoken, and sometimes very much a spoken, expectation that you don't intentionally campaign. Like, you might allow it to be known that you wouldn't say, "Don't you dare nominate me for this," but that's about as far as that goes. You're willing to take the job if you're elected, but that's the closest.
Which is super problematic on a number of levels, but...
Oh yes, no, there are issues with that, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But the idea is you don't campaign, and because you're supposed to take that honor only when called by God, which is what the election is supposed to do. It's supposed to show forth the Holy Spirit at work in the community, ideally. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, you're not really supposed to write policy for ideal situations. That's not what policy is supposed to do. But it reminds me of the moment in the musical Hamilton when Thomas Jefferson is so deeply offended by Aaron Burr having campaigned against him actively, which was a whole new thing, apparently, according to the musical, which I believe historically is not entirely accurate. But in the musical, it is a new idea. That he changes the law so that Burr won't be vice president, having come in second in the election.
I remember that.
Yes.
I think it's very funny that this skipped verse got included on the week that I'm here, because it's a verse that gets me in trouble a fair amount. As a minister who is not a clergy person, and who probably 3/4 of my friends are clergy people, I always have to be very careful when I admit the fact that I don't necessarily think the role of pastor or priest has to exist. Like, I love y'all, you're doing a great job, and also I don't think your job should be here. It's a difficult conversation to have. But part of what Hebrews is about, whether we think it's right or wrong, is that we don't need priests because we already had one. And there's this idea that while certainly there are things we need to do in the world to organize ourselves, and we probably do need to have people in charge of things, that the role of our spiritual head has already been filled. And so I struggle a lot, I'll be honest, with the way in which our systems of authority are structured. I struggle with the fact that we, in our congregational life, choose one person to be our spiritual head. And I actually experienced it much more in Episcopal contexts. While I spend most of my time in the Lutheran world these days, I did work at an Episcopal church for 4 years and was also confirmed Episcopalian, and still occasionally work in that world. And in that tradition, you literally have to call your priest father or mother. I guess non-binary people apparently don't exist because they won't accept the title of parent. You just have to choose father or mother. And I'm not doing that.
I didn't realize that.
1, because it's creepy.
Yeah.
2, because non-binary people exist. But 3, because scripture literally told us not to. Like, Jesus himself in Matthew was like, don't call anybody else father. you have one. And so I think, and it's not just that. I mean, in that same verse, I think he says, don't call yourself a teacher. And as someone who, a lot of my work as a Christian educator, I have to be really careful about thinking that I'm an authority on anything. I simply was in a position to get some schooling and get some information, and I can, communicate that information to other people. It doesn't mean I know anything about anything, and it doesn't mean that I'm qualified to be in charge. And so I think that I really would like for us to start having some of those conversations about when there is so much in Scripture saying, don't do this. Don't create for yourself these pyramidal structures with one person at the head. And that's exactly what we went and did. Is it too late for us to change? Can we start having conversations about what it might look like if we started to approach authority and organization of our communities differently? Well, at the same time, not wanting to invalidate the work of all of my friends who are wonderful priests and pastors.
Yeah, Jessica, I was thinking about it, and I remember, particularly as a queer person, my youth director, when I talked to him about being called to be a pastor, he had some really bad experiences with a pastor, and this like lording over the authority and pastoral authority stuff. And he was like, I don't believe in ordination, but I believe in yours. And it was this like particular moment that has always stuck with me. And I think it's connected, right? Like Hebrews is the only one that really calls Jesus a high priest. Like I don't think it shows up other places, and there's a reason for that. Like there's a lot about Hebrews, like you said, Jessica, that there's a lot about Hebrews that's like questionable, or like, okay, we need to unpack this. And it's very clear how that, in particular, Hebrews ties into the hierarchy that we've created in the Christian church, originally in like the Catholic and Orthodox churches, that has been inherited, that we haven't counteracted in all of our like protesting against them. Like we still have that, the pastor is head, and that's been like the justification for why only men are allowed to be ordained in certain denominations and all of this stuff, when the reality is the church and the systems as we know them are dying. They're not going to be sustained. The institutionality itself is crumbling quicker and quicker as time goes by. And we need that. I was just talking to one of my parishioners about our Ash Wednesday service, because we are recording this the day after Ash Wednesday. And he was talking about like the gift of this different and creative way of being and connecting spiritually, because we did this whole different thing with Ash Wednesday. It involved no ashes and no crosses on people's foreheads, but was deeply meaningful and spiritual, and a way to get people to engage in that spirituality in their own homes. And so thinking about those different dynamics of what does it look like to have church, to have worship, to have communities of faith that don't look like congregations with pastors who become bishops, who become...
Yeah, I always have an interesting experience going into a new parish, especially if, less if it's a consulting gig and more if it's, I'm going to work at this place for, the foreseeable future, where I have to, as gently as possible, make sure that the pastor or pastors there know that I am their colleague and not their employee, that I work for the congregation and I answer to the council. And if there's a mutual ministry committee, I answer to them as well. I don't answer to the pastor. And I often have to remind folks who are pastors, hey, I have the same level of theological education as you do. In many cases, I have more. I took all of the classes you did and wrote a thesis and took like 9 extra for my specialty areas and did 3 extra units of CBE. So no, I don't work for you. Mm-hmm. And those are difficult conversations to have, but I insist on having them, not just because it's a justice issue for me, but because once we've had them, then I can start opening folks' eyes to the idea that, oh, actually, not just pastors are called. And I think for Lutherans in particular, we have this idea that all people are called by God to be ministers in many different ways. And I think that particularly in the Lutheran Church in the US and in Germany, we do a really poor job of honoring, that which we claim to believe around people's vocation.
Yeah.
And so if I really put my foot down around that, then I'm able to start having conversations with other folks like, hey, God called you to be a minister and wouldn't have called you and then not qualified you. You are qualified. So let's start looking at what that call might look like for you. Like, let's start visioning about what your ministry is going to be. And that's really exciting work that I'd love to do.
I love that. I love it too.
And we have to live up to it if we're going to say that there is one baptism and we are all baptized in the same baptism. Mm-hmm. We don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Priesthood of all believers.
As far as the election piece goes, I think that the way we do elections on paper is great. In real life, everybody campaigns and everybody knows everybody campaigns. And I think, in recent years, we've really started having conversations around, if God is choosing who our leaders are, why are so many of them white dudes? Because that really doesn't reflect what we say about God or the world or the church.
Yeah.
And we have started having really intense conversations. I know myself and you as well, Emily, have really had to poke some people and say, are you sure that God only wants us to consider white dudes for this role? You're positive? Because if you're not positive, maybe you should stand aside if you're a white dude. Those conversations have been kind of stressful.
When I have thought about this and talked about this with the many people who I'm like, I don't think you need to put, like, there's the part of the mythos and the ethos of, like, not campaigning. That's how all of the white guys, like, get elected, because they don't have to campaign. They don't have to do the discernment. They don't have to ask the hard questions of, am I really the best qualified, best person for this job? And then the people who do campaign, who are not the cishet white guys, my experience of it has been they've actually done the really good and deep and faithful discernment to say, am I called? And it's not everyone, but a lot of people, right? Like, am I called to be bishop, to be in this leadership role?
Yeah.
And that discernment happens within the context of the communities that they're a part of, right? I had a friend who did stand for election as bishop this year in the synod that I'm in. She and I had multiple conversations. Multiple people had conversations with her, right? Like, I make a point of, if I think that you might be a good bishop, I'm going to tell you, because I need you to know that at least one other person is noticing this too. But also that there's a larger context when this synod has only known white, able-bodied men as bishop, to have someone who feels called to be bishop who doesn't fit those categories. Like, there's a different way of approaching the world. I approach the world differently because I'm non-binary, because I'm queer, and that is a gift for leadership that we don't get if we say you can't campaign, you can't want it. Discernment is not the same thing as just wanting more power.
Yeah.
Right.
And thinking back, I have definitely gone through, I have consistently worked in areas and synods that are very big on the don't toot your own horn concept, which leads to people who, have perfectly good horns not getting noticed, and being left behind in favor of the folks who have less marginalization.
More privilege and more access already, which is by default.
Yeah. I mean, I think our system is really deeply broken, and I'm not without hope, because I know that there are communities all over the world who are really good at community discernment. And here in the United States, we have so many indigenous communities that are really good at community discernment. And that if we took the time to listen and paid them for their labor, they could teach us how to do it better. There are ways to listen for the voice of the divine individually, in small groups, in large communities, to hear for the voice of the divine in one another. There are really specific practices that communities can be doing to be preparing for these big decisions, years ahead of time. So yeah, I think that if we are willing to take the leap of faith that says our model might not be the best model, that there's really extraordinary possibility.
Yeah. And now it's time to jump into our gospel reading, which is 2 chapters long, so this is going to take a while. Buckle your seatbelts. Our first section of the gospel reading is from John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. Judas betrays Jesus in the garden near the Kidron Valley. Soldiers and police arrest Jesus, and Jesus discourages Peter from further violence.
So one of the themes in this passage for me was this idea of mob brutality. Specifically, it reminded me a lot of like lynchings and lynch mobs, but also the coup attempt at the Capitol in January, and this way that groups with the military, with the police, violently attack, right? That harm people, and particularly people who are vulnerable, or institutions, to exert power in deadly ways.
Yeah. So I read verse 3, which says, So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And I read the last phrase of that, with lanterns and torches and weapons, and my brain automatically wants to substitute the last word for pitchforks, because torches and pitchforks is such a common phrase. And the image that I get in my head when I read this verse is from Beauty and the Beast, with the townspeople getting all riled up by Gaston to go attack the castle and singing. And okay, that is an extremely surreal vision to have while you're reading the Passion story. And is also such a wildly different level of complete lack of seriousness as opposed to what this story is actually telling. And going back to Jessica's earlier comment about there are times when you have to change how you present certain information, because if you present the brutal truth, people will just shut down. For a lot of people, the image from Beauty and the Beast with the torches and pitchforks is the closest that they get to having any experience with a story like the Passion story. And that kind of ridiculousness, you need to be able to move past it in order to really tell the Good Friday story and have that part of the story land in a useful way.
So yeah, I think this idea of, comparing this scene to a Disney musical is definitely surreal, and I probably will never be able to unsee it. But I think it's apt, at least in the idea that we should really examine the power that song has as a uniting force, both for good and for evil. It actually was one of the areas that I focused on in my work in Holocaust studies, was the way in which song was used, in particular, unfortunately, the hymns of the Lutheran Church were used to great effect to convince Christians to take up arms against their Jewish neighbors. And that is a truth that we need to sit with, and it's a truth that I hope we start to examine. But the flip side of that is when we look at movements like the singing revolutions in Eastern Europe, where, on one occasion, over 1 million people stood in the street and held hands and sang and overthrew a government, or at the very least began the energy behind the movement to overthrow a government with the power of song, I think is extraordinary. I think when we look at South Africa and we look at the incredible power of song behind the ways in which the people were able to fight against apartheid, it's real. Like, we are united when we sing. And something I do when I'm conducting, or, when I'm working with choirs, is I don't let anybody start unless we breathe together, right? So if I am getting ready to bring the choir in and I realize we didn't all breathe at the same time, we're not ready to start. Because there is this thing that happens with choral singing, or, anytime people sing together, where you become more than yourself. you become a part of this much larger entity. Mm-hmm. And I think we really need to acknowledge that it's an entity that carries some danger with it. And, you know, as we were looking at this, both the Disney story and the Jesus story, I couldn't help but think about two events in my own life. One being the first time I went to a Trump rally. It was pretty early on in his campaign. And, you know, things were fairly calm for most of the day, owning mostly to the fact that the police had the Trump supporters on one side of the street and us on the other side of the street. And there was a line of cops down the middle. And I do, you know, most people know I'm not a huge fan of the police, but the sergeant that was responsible was so smart in the way that he engaged his officers. He made the entire thing a conversation, and he instructed his officers, talk to those people about why they're there and don't give them anything back. Literally just be invested in hearing their story. So we had this line of cops that was just chatting with people for most of the day. But then what had happened was a bunch of us had bought tickets intending to go and protest from inside the rally. Well, the people at the rally figured that out, and then they started basically not admitting anyone to the rally that didn't look like the typical Trump supporter. And so then what ended up happening was there was a group of us on the outside while the rally was happening. Most of the police were inside. And as people at the Trump rally realized that there wasn't a police presence, they then started coming back outside. And at that point had been, you know, pretty fired up by the rally. And there was this moment when this guy spat in the face of a teenager wearing a hijab. And she was very clearly a young teenager, you know, somewhere between 12 and 14 probably. And this adult man stood with his family and spat in her face. And I stood in front of her and, you know, sort of pushed her behind me. And I looked in his eyes, and I have never seen such naked hatred. This man despised us, like with every fiber of his being. And I don't think I really got the power of mob mentality until that moment. I don't think I really comprehended, even, you know, being a Black person in America and knowing that lynchings happen today, I don't think I got it until that moment. But then on the flip side of that same year, I had the opportunity to participate in the world's largest meditation event. More than 20,000 people across the world gathered, some just, you know, alone in their homes. I was at a yoga studio. We were invited to take seriously the idea that if people can gather and use their interconnectedness to drive others to hatred and violence, then we could do that same thing for the opposite of that. And so we were literally just asked to spend this time meditating and projecting all of our energies on justice and peace. And I had, you know, really the exact opposite response that I did at that Trump rally. I felt something bigger than myself happening in that space. And so I really I encourage us to take those things seriously, to know that we are deeply interconnected, and to know that we can affect one another even without our words. We can affect one another simply through song, simply through our energy. In South Africa, we saw the power of dance used to overthrow tyranny, but to also really be aware of the dangerous aspects of that. And that, you know, had we been present at that moment with Jesus, who would we have been?
Yeah, when I think about that, I also think about verse 10 in that passage where Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. That's part of it, right? That those choices that we make about how we resist evil and what that looks like. And at different points, there have been times and places where it is to take up arms, and there have been times and places where it is not. And I think for a lot of my life, was like very ardent pacifist, and the more deeply I get into justice work, the more it feels complicated. Not to say that I would advocate for cutting off people's ears, but that I understand more deeply when there is violence that is committed, or when there is resistance to violence, resistance to harm that is not just taking it. And I think about Laya in Ember in the Ashes, because she grows up and she's part of the very oppressed group, and she's not involved in the resistance. Her parents were part of the resistance and she's decidedly not, and then ends up like taking up the mantle of the resistance, and even like surpassing that, to be fighting for not only her people, the scholars, but for the whole future of this whole group of people. And she ends up taking up the sword to do it. She tries not to, and she does her best not to kill people and like those sorts of things, but ultimately she fights. And yeah, I think I wonder about that, given the coup attempt and given like the history and the ways that it's repeating itself between Hitler and Trump and those patterns. Yeah. And I want to be like, no, we can sing our way through this. Like, I desperately want to be able to just sing our way through this, to show up in nonviolent ways. But I live in Iowa, and there's nothing that is getting through to the leadership to make change. And we're running out of like ideas. We have some more ideas.
Yeah.
I am not saying like we're going to get violent all of a sudden, but it's hard when it is consistently not working and not working and not working to know how to resist.
Yeah. Well, it's not a funny topic in any way, but I do have to say that every time I encounter this part of the story with Simon Peter, I can't help but think about this Mad TV skit that they did based on this scene, except Peter was the Terminator. And so he keeps coming back to kill Judas to save Jesus, and Jesus has to keep bringing him back to life. And he's like, no, this is supposed to happen. And the Terminator's like, okay, but I'll be back. And then he comes back and he saves Judas again. And Jesus is like, you're not getting it. This is why I came here.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Oh, I love that.
I love it. And I have to watch it every year.
Wow.
But I do think we have to have these conversations about, those of us who at least are trying to be on the side of justice and honoring all people as created by and part of God's existence. We have to really get clear on what risks are we willing to take on behalf of those beliefs. One of the things that I have white folks do when I have them in anti-racism trainings is make action plans. What things will you do in the next month? What things will you do in the next 6 months? What things will you do in the next year? And then what risks are you willing to take? And we go through what career risks, what risks to your family relationships, what risks to your body. And you need to decide before you're in the situation.
Yeah.
And so for me, I no longer describe myself as a pacifist. I really call myself anti-violence, in that I am not going to be the one to incite violence. But if violence is the only type of conversation that other folks are willing to have, and particularly if the lives of other minority people are at risk, I am willing to use violence to save their lives. And I really had to get clear about that. And so for me, it is a very real possibility that I could be in a situation where a white person is causing extreme harm to a Black child, trying to kill a Black child. It's a very real possibility that one or more of those white people might be police. I am clear on the fact that I won't start by using my body to remedy that situation, but I absolutely will use my body to remedy that situation if I have to. Mm-hmm. I am clear on the fact that this country is going to stop killing our children by any means necessary. And I don't want it to have to be by violence. But I also understand that actually the people that determine that are white folks, right? We don't have the systemic power to make that decision. And, as an abolitionist, it's often during Holy Week that I have the most conversations, because as people are witnessing this story about a person of color who is executed by the state for protesting too much, it's impossible to not start thinking about what life is like in the United States. And it's impossible to not start having at least the tiniest bit of doubt that this system we have, where we have this super highly militarized police force, is not alarmingly similar to what's happening in this gospel story. And so it's often during Holy Week that I have people reach out to me and want to start talking about abolition.
Yeah. I was feeling it this year in particular in a different way than I have in the past, and particularly noticing that it was the military, like the soldiers and the police and religious authorities. And we'll get into it more, I think, in the next few readings. But yeah.
I always feel kind of awkward about saying that Good Friday is one of my favorite church holidays, because it's a weird... I feel the same way about saying that I think I'm pretty good at funerals. There are just some things that this job has you say, and it sounds weird. But on the one hand, I love Good Friday because, wow, this is such a story, and we get to tell this story, and it's so powerful. And on the other hand, it bothers me that we package all this up into one day, because there is so much here. And as we are discovering with this episode, I wish we would spread it out a little more and spend more time on it, because there is so much going on.
Definitely.
Our next reading is John chapter 18, verses 12 through 27. Jesus is questioned by the religious authorities, while just outside, Peter is questioned about his connection to Jesus and denies him. So one of the themes that came up for me in this passage was the idea of family power or dynasties. So we hear about Caiaphas and his father-in-law Annas, and I was thinking about, there are family businesses that are passed down from generation to generation. There's also presidencies that are getting passed down in really unhelpful ways. But eventually, whether it's politics or business, someone doesn't want to continue that, and then to get out of the family business. There are so very many novels written about this person grew up with this family business and then it was sold, and then they didn't want it. Yeah,
I feel like there's a TV show that Gordon Ramsay used to do where he would go around and fix terrible restaurants, and 1/3 of the episodes were that story. It was a family business and the next generation did not want it but were being forced into it. And
yeah. And I think there are ways that we inherit family stuff that's beautiful, but this particular setting didn't seem like that to me.
Sometimes you don't need that third set of china or whatever.
Tracy Morgan has a show based on his actual life, and he was living in Brooklyn in the 80s, in a time where really the only way you could get even to lower middle class was to be a drug dealer. But he decides at one point that he's going to stop selling crack because it's just too dangerous. And, he's telling his boss, you got 2 more weeks out of me, then I'm out, I'm going straight. And his boss is like, are you trying to give me your 2 weeks notice as a crack dealer? That's not a thing that happens.
That's fantastic.
What form do you fill out for that? Anyway, yeah.
Right? Yeah. As we dive into the verses, in verse 12, we read that the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. And the binding, right? So we have all of the military and police, and then the binding just made me think of in Star Wars when they're on the planet of the Ewoks and they capture Han and Luke and they're carrying them bound to what turns out to be Princess Leia and C-3PO.
Yes.
Totally different, a similar kind of binding, but one they got out of and one they didn't.
Nobody expects surprise Ewoks.
True, they're too cute.
Yes. In verse 16, we hear, "So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in." Okay, so first I want to point out that the person guarding the gate here is a woman. Nobody ever seems to notice that, but I love that detail. But the part of this that actually jumped out at me this time is the other disciple, who doesn't get named because, this is the Bible, so why would we bother naming anyone? And after they get Peter inside the gate, we never see them again, I don't think, in this story. Like, presumably they are among the other disciples when the disciples are around, but we never get to find out who they are. And the thing is, it's because of who this disciple knows that this whole part of the story happens, and that Jesus's prophecy about Peter can play out, and Peter will deny him 3 times. If this disciple didn't know whoever it was inside, like, that part of the story would never have happened. Who you know can be so incredibly crucial, which makes me think of Harry Potter, and the Order of the Phoenix needed Mundungus Fletcher's connections and relationships that no one else had. Sometimes it really is about who you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think I always assumed the other disciple was the beloved disciple, but yeah, it's...
Yeah, but we're not really sure who that is either. Yeah. I know that you have a personal favorite pet theory, but...
I do.
I think we all do.
Theories. Yeah. Yep. We'll get into that one of these days. I'm sure that the beloved disciple will come up.
Or 12 of them. Yeah.
I wanted to go a different route than, talking about drugs again, but honestly, that's where my mind goes. Just thinking of scenarios in which, I've been around when someone was overdosing and, just desperately begging people, please, I know you know them. I saw you together. I've seen you hanging out every day this week. I know you know them. Please tell me what you think they took so I know how to proceed. And because our culture's relationship with drugs is so terribly broken and so horribly criminalized, people are in the position of watching their friend die and not being able to say, yes, this is my friend. And not even being able to, let alone, naming, whatever substances they think they're on, but you can't have the experience of your friend dying because you can't admit that it's your friend. And I mean, those times are just so heartbreaking on every level. And you're trying desperately to think of what are the words I can say that will convince you that I don't care, I'm not calling the cops, I hate the cops, I just want to help your friend. And there are times where you just can't figure out what those words are.
Yeah, I have had some similar experiences at the hospital because frequently overdoses come into our resuscitation room, and I just really just need to know the medical, just want to save this person's life.
But why would they believe us?
Right. Yeah. There's no reason to believe it. It's not going to go to the police. It's not going to come back to harm them.
One of the things that happened, in particular during what our country likes to call the crack epidemic, but there are a whole lot of levels to that. One thing that would happen, and I saw myself in my nursing career, would be that white nurses would intentionally build a rapport with young Black women who were in the hospital giving birth and would try and get them to admit to crack use, at any point in their life. At any point. And then immediately after they had delivered and were in a state where they couldn't possibly get up and walk, would call the cops and would have the cops come and arrest them in their hospital bed after they had just given birth. And I think, it's interesting that this is where my mind is going, but I think that these are all situations that really speak to what is our relationship with authority. And when we're in a position where we're a go-between, between someone who's more vulnerable than us and a person who has great authority, how are we going to behave?
Yeah. I think the medical field is also, as you're naming the examples from the medical field, right, that's such a precarious place because there's so much power and authority in, especially doctors, but doctors and nurses in general, and then, those also as go-betweens to contacting DHS or contacting Child Protective Services or police, and, the ways that we wield power versus empowering and supporting the power of others. And it is an important thing to think about. And I think especially as a pastor, there are similar places of power, and how do I use my power, and how does it harm others?
When I teach courses on how to be an interrupter for white folks, a lot of the people in my class are, end up being pastors. And one of the things I have to get folks really, really clear on is you have to decide now what risks you're willing to take in which situations. How are you willing to use your body in what situations? Will that change if you have kids and you have them with you? that's probably going to change, and you need to like work that all out ahead of time, because I've watched pastors be in situations where they could have used their power to be an interrupter for violence, but they panicked and they didn't have a plan. And so hopefully, as I work with more and more people, we can get more and more people, out in our communities that actually have some kind of a plan.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, somebody posted that the other, and then I was like, no, it was you. But yeah, it's something that I've thought about. I took a course in seminary called Urban Peacemaking in a Culture of Violence. It was in Chicago, and so we had people from the interrupters who came and talked to us, and we did, like, not just the talking about stuff, but then also, like, what's the role play? Like, how do you play this out and practice physically putting yourself in harm's way so that when it comes time, you can actually do it. Like, your body knows what it is to do that.
Yeah. And if people haven't seen the documentary about the interrupters in Chicago, their work is just exceptional. I think everyone needs to see that, but especially white folks, I think, need to see it. And if people are wanting to get training, it does vary geographically, but I would say in general, Quaker communities tend to do a pretty good job of offering training spaces around how to do that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And we'll link to the Interrupters documentary for sure in our episode description.
Our next gospel passage is John 18, verses 28 through 40. Jesus is handed over to the Roman Empire and Pilate, who questions him and seems confused by the whole process, and asks the crowd gathered what they want.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage was the perspectives and moral authority. And so we get Pilate asking about, like, what the accusations are and, like, what his power is. And it's one of those things that, like, both sides think that they're right within a system that is so very corrupt, right? Like, the religious authorities think that they're doing the best thing possible. Jesus thinks he's doing the best thing possible. And obviously, like, as followers of Christ, we have our own particular, like, bias towards Jesus. But both of them are within a larger system of oppression that doesn't give them good choices. I grew up with, like, you always have a choice to make. And somebody posted the other day on Facebook, and it was like, yeah, but you don't always have good choices.
Right.
Like, you always have options, but you don't always have good options. And so I was reminded somewhat of the Avengers Civil War, where the Avengers kind of split, and some are trying to work within the, like, not government, but, like, multi-nation.
Within the system, yeah.
Within the system, and others are like, no, this is wrong. I'm not going to participate. And both of them are, like, morally convicted that what they're doing is right. And both of them are stuck within this corrupt system that will cause harm no matter what. And so how do you make the least bad decision?
See, my major problem with the Civil War plotline in the MCU was that it was one of those situations where the whole thing could have been solved if there was a long, extended conversation between, like, two of the characters, specifically Steve and Tony. And so my response to that is that I have wanted to lock Steve and Tony in a closet for a couple of hours for years now, and just let them, yell at each other. Or it can be a well-stocked conference room with nice windows and snacks or something if you insist. That's fine. But just someplace where they have to talk to each other and they can't get out until they hash everything out. I now am wondering if you could do the same thing with Jesus and Pilate. I'm not really sure that would work, but it's a slightly different kind of relationship. They don't really have the chemistry that Steve and Tony do, but still.
I'm always interested in the question of perspectives when it comes to, in particular, this story. A few years ago, Spark House put out some videos designed to take preschoolers through Holy Week, and they were all told through the perspective of the donkey. And of course, the Good Friday material, is very brief in general, but it really got me thinking, as we're reading these texts, who are we in this scene? And I've started really asking folks in congregations that. And I, at first, was surprised at the frequency with which people answer, oh, I'm one of his friends that was standing up for him. And I have to remind them, those people aren't there. There's none of those people. So if we truly believe that this is our story, who are we in this story? And how likely would it be that we would have been one of the people that were screaming for his execution? And so, that's certainly not a comfortable question to ask ourselves, but I think it's a super important one to ask ourselves. And also, for those of us who, are somewhat public figures or do have a position of authority, would we have been Pilate? Would we have been Caiaphas? I don't know, but I know that the question's important.
Yeah, I grew up with the connection that was made was the shouts of Hosanna turned into shouts of Crucify, which I think I grew up with a pretty good theological and pastoral leadership because it did put that connection that you're talking about, Jessica, on. We're not, there are no friends sticking up for Jesus. We're not Jesus. And therefore that leaves, the shouts of Crucify or the questions and the debates about what is true, right? Like the questions that Pilate poses. And none of them are good roles. We don't want those roles, but that's literally what is happening.
Yeah. One year I was at a very small congregation with no money and no technology, and I had to come up with something to tell the Passion story on Good Friday without just, having it be read and everyone fall asleep. And so my answer for that was, and I couldn't get enough volunteers because everyone was already volunteered for Monday, Thursday, or Easter Sunday or whatever. So instead, I read the narrative parts, and I had the congregation read all the spoken lines. And so they got to be everyone. And it started off pretty normal because earlier in the Passion story, it's just people going from one to the other. It's not that emotional. But as it got further along, they started getting more and more into it. And you could see the emotions in the congregation change, and when they got to the crucify him scene, they really realized what that was and what it meant. And I may have to do that again one day.
Yeah, I think that's a good question that you posed, Jessica, of who are we in this scene, and then to have that be how you navigate being all of these different people. To say what are we gonna? Yeah.
In verse 29. We hear, so Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" As you might imagine, I have read this passage a few times before, but reading the passage this time, it strikes me that Pilate just seems confused in this version of the gospel in John. He seems endlessly baffled. I've seen him played in several different ways in different passion plays or people doing skit versions of this. Sometimes he's wise, sometimes he's manipulative, and so on. And sometimes he's a perfect innocent and also kind of just not very bright. But really I'm wondering if his morning first century coffee substitute just hasn't kicked in yet. I don't know if they would have had coffee at this time and place, but whatever he's using for his morning caffeine, just, who is this guy? Why did you bring him here? Jesus, what's up with you? And so on. He reminds me of, in Star Trek Voyager, they had a constant coffee shortage, and Captain Janeway ran on coffee, and so we regularly retreated to seeing her without coffee and what she was like, just deeply baffled and kind of cranky, and that reminds me of what Pilate is doing throughout this scene for the next several chunks of the gospel reading.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've never really thought of it that way. I think because Jesus describes Pilate as a fox in Luke's version of the story, I think I tend to take that reading and then sort of apply it to all of the versions of the story without really honoring okay, this is a separate story. So I'll have to go back and read it again and try and get that remark out of my head and just see who Pilate, appears to be to me, in this text.
I think part of the confusion, reading the confusion in this version for me, is that he keeps wandering from one room to the other and going out and talking to the crowd and wandering back in and talking to Jesus and wandering back out and talking to someone else. And it's just he's a ping pong ball, and he doesn't really seem to know where he's going. He doesn't really seem to have a direction. He's just doing what seems to be the best idea at the time and just kind of going with it.
Interesting. I read those verses too, and I definitely had a very different response to them.
Cool.
And I think growing up, maybe not growing up, but at some point in my life, I definitely had the poor Pilate. He's placed in this awful situation and doesn't want to do this and is pressured by the crowd to do this. And the more I learned about and started to understand systems and institutions and structural oppression and occupation and our criminal and justice system, I was maybe not. Like, I read it as Pilate, yes, being, like, stuck in a position, but being stuck in a position because he desperately wants to hold on to his power, and so has to navigate how to keep the power and authority of the Roman Empire and not encourage insurrection. And so there's this, like, less of a, like, what do I do, than of a, okay, I have this power, and, like, let me navigate the, like, narrow road that I have to navigate to hold all of the authority that I have and not lose any of it. And I think that's, like, when Pilate asks, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they answer, if this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. And it's just this, like, to me, it speaks so clearly to the injustice built in the criminal justice system, right? That,
yeah,
clearly this person's a criminal, or we wouldn't have brought them. Like, the number of times we've heard that, particularly, like, here where I am in Des Moines this year with protests, like, clearly you wouldn't have been arrested if you weren't doing the wrong thing. There's a journalist who's going to trial in March because she was arrested while covering one of the protests, and they haven't dropped the charges.
Yeah.
And it's so, like, blatantly obvious that this is unjust, but it's still this system that says, nope, this is how it goes, and this is what's going to happen. Who cares about like, what's real and what's true?
I think that being in situations like this where there's any sort of mob mentality, or if you're just, in a situation where systemic violence is so pervasive that, it's just sort of everywhere, it can be easy to think, well, the ball's rolling down the hill and there's nothing we can do to stop it. But very, very often, it literally only takes one person with some sort of power in the system to be like, yo, this isn't cool. We're not going to do this, to actually, interrupt that cycle. Mm-hmm. When I counsel young Black folks, especially, young Black men or boys, I think a lot of people want to try and make it really simple and coach them to either, it will explain to the police what your rights are, explain to the police that, you don't have to tell them your address or, whatever it is at the time. And other people want to say, oh, no, it's very simple, just don't say anything. Well, I mean, I personally have experienced what happens when someone like with a gun in their hand asks you a question and you don't say anything. It usually doesn't go very well. And so what I tend to counsel them is like, you've lived in a Black body for 10 or 12 or 15 years, however long it is. You know how to read white people. Look in their face, figure out what they want you to say, and say that to stay alive. And if you have reached a point where you're so done that you're literally willing to give your life, I'm not going to judge you for saying whatever it is that's in your heart and that you feel like you need to say. But like, if your goal is to stay alive in this encounter, figure out what they want. Figure out what character they want you to be and be that. And I will be honest, in most of my interactions with police, I become yes, massa, all the way. Whatever you want. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. Sir, ma'am, all day long. Oh, sir, I'm so sorry, sir. What can I do, sir? Does it make me feel good about myself? No. But I think that there is, this real pervasive dynamic that happens when we have people who know that they can wield their power in any way they want, and there are no interrupters. So that the only way that you can survive that is to literally just become whoever it is that they see you as.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. That's sort of always what I think of when, Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? He knows what he's doing by asking that question. He's asking like 17 questions by asking that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the particular context of the United States, it is impossible to read this story without thinking about Black and brown people, right? Especially, and like, the reporter that I was talking about before is a woman of color, and she's the one that's still got charges, not the white guy that was taking pictures. I think about James Cone and the cross on the lynching tree, and like to try to read one of these without the other.
I've had a few conversations over the last several months with I was about to say young woman, but she's not. She's a child. With the child who filmed George Floyd's murder, and she just will not accept any help, none whatsoever. because she knows what white people will think of her if she accepts any money for her family, or, you know, there's been offers of scholarships. I've begged her, like, let me just get you therapy. Like, I know so many people, you know, in the area where you live, like, just get you some free therapy. And she's like, no, all I want is prayers. And she wouldn't even ask for prayers for herself. All I want is for people to pray for my family, because her younger siblings have been traumatized as well. And it's heartbreaking. But I can't say that she's wrong. As soon as she would dare accept a cent, you know, people would be coming from every side to get her.
Yep. And even, like, therapy, and, like, even if it was, like, pro bono therapy or whatever, but the stigma around it and the, see, she's unstable, how do we trust, that would immediately happen. Never mind that it's therapy because of this traumatic event that she witnessed and recorded.
And I think a lot about the adult white woman who was standing there recording too, and who didn't release her footage, and how this has had no consequences for her life. Yeah.
Our next gospel reading is John chapter 19, verses 1 through 7. Pilate has Jesus flogged to appease the crowd, but led by police and religious authorities, they still insist he be crucified. So one of the most evident themes for me in this passage is mockery, right? They put a crown of thorns on his head. They say, "Hail." They give him purple cloth. And it reminded me of the moment in Harry Potter when the Slytherins, led by Draco, are singing "Weasley is our king." The initial version, the original version, that is just like a complete mockery of and derision of Ron Weasley. That is such a vivid comparison, because it's literally like making Jesus into the king and making fun of that. And as we get into the verses, when the chief priests and police saw Jesus and they shout, "Crucify him, crucify him," I was thinking about in the Ember and the Ashes series, which I talk about quite a bit because I love it. Elias, when he is still a student at Blackcliff, has to shout for death and punishment for a student who deserts, but like throughout the time that he's at Blackcliff. I wonder about those who maybe didn't want to shout and didn't know how to be in a crowd shouting for Jesus' death without joining in. Like, that for Elias, the only way he could live was to shout for the death of this other person. Otherwise, he would be punished in the same way. And I think so often that's the choice we're given. Shout for someone else's death. Again, in a death-dealing culture, you shout for somebody else's death or you end up in the same position.
Is it, though? I mean, we live in the United States. I think that there are certainly places in the world where that's true.
Mm-hmm.
I just, that's not the U.S. that I see. Mm-hmm. I don't see most of the people in this country who are systematically privileged being in a position where if you speak up for someone else, you'll be put to death.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I wasn't thinking of, like, the people with privilege, and particularly, like, institutional and systemic privilege. I was thinking more about, like, what you were saying with the friends, where a friend has overdosed, and that's their choices are to say what happened and risk so much, including their own arrest and their own going to jail and whatever might happen from that, or their friend dies, and, like, those sorts of things. So I guess I was not clear. Like, I don't think that most of the time, I am not in this position. Occasionally I've been in a position that feels close to this, or feels like it has this sense, not of death, but of, like, arrest or of that sort of thing. But I do think, like, for people who are over-policed all the time, for people who are fighting against the drug wars, that's not what I actually want to call them.
I know what you mean, though.
Yeah, so I was not clear on that. Thank you for clarifying that. It is a very big difference for that.
I'm glad it came up, though, because that is something that I deal with a lot when I am teaching about racism and how to interrupt racism. I have found that, by and large, for white folks, especially white folks who are not in other vulnerable communities, there's sort of this category of, like, bad things might happen to me if I take action, and they all feel like death. And so I really have to do a lot of work with folks of getting them grounded in their bodies so that they can actually do some assessment of what will happen to me, what could happen to me if I take action here, right? Like, I might get arrested. That's not death. I might get punched in the face. That's not death either. So if you are watching the cops kill somebody, I need you to explain to me why you getting arrested would stop you from intervening. And when we have those conversations, then they start to realize that this category of bad things will happen to me. They're not all the same. But I think especially if you haven't experienced them before, you can start just thinking in extremis. But so, yeah, it's really, and it's not something I realized. Unfortunately, a lot of my life has been lived in extremis. And so I didn't realize until just a couple years ago that that's what it feels like to folks sometimes. Like, oh, if I do the right thing, I'll die. That, like, even though that's not true, that might be what your body is telling you.
Yeah. That if my body is not used to being in danger, all danger feels like death.
Yeah.
And there is danger in sticking up for people, but it's not all that. Yeah.
Well, and the opposite can also be true. If your body becomes too used to danger, then all danger can also feel like death if you're in a constantly traumatic environment. The real-life situation that this reminds me of is I have a number of friends in my online social circle who are either minors or legally adults, but stuck living in a unpleasant, to say the least, situation, generally with parents. And their parents will spout off hateful concepts and ideas fairly constantly, and they are offered the choice of either risk getting thrown out and homelessness, or risk getting the crap beaten out of you, or speak up and it's not actually going to do anything because they're not going to change that person's mind, So that's the thought I was having. Or for another fictional example, the thought that came to mind was the TV miniseries version of Handmaid's Tale. The handmaids are actually quite often offered the choice between you can either take part in this person's death or you can be physically tortured. And that happens a few times.
And that's one of the reasons why I always sort of throw in another perspective when people are talking about, life in the U.S. today is just like The Handmaid's Tale, particularly if the people saying it are like white and middle class and straight and able-bodied. Your life isn't like that. Yeah. And convincing yourself that it is going to make you less likely to use your privilege to help other people.
Right. In verse 7, we hear the crowd say, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." There is a Star Trek The Next Generation episode which is called Justice, named ironically on purpose, I'm sure. The Enterprise visits a planet that the Federation hasn't talked to before, and they are surprised to discover that the idyllic planet avoids crime by having all rule-breaking punished by death. Just all of it. So there is a character in Star Trek The Next Generation named Wesley, played by Will Wheaton as a child, who was not generally viewed fondly by a lot of fans because he tended to be magically brilliant in lots of different ways. And so at one point he runs across a lawn, but there's a "keep off the grass" sign, and so he is immediately condemned to death, and this is how the Enterprise learns that this is the criminal justice system on this planet. And the excuse that the people from the planet keep saying is, well, this is our law. This is how it works for us. And it very much reminds me of this line. Sometimes just because it's a law doesn't mean that it's the correct choice.
Yeah, it's funny. I have seen maybe 4 Next Generation episodes in my life, but this is one that I have actually seen. And I use it a lot with youth groups and stuff like that to talk about, how do we figure out if something is an unjust law? How do we figure out as Christians what our relationship to the law is supposed to be? And it's not something, at least, the young people that I come in contact with, it's not something that their families or their churches talk to them much about. There's sort of this vague understanding of okay, yes, as a Christian, I have a responsibility not to obey unjust laws. But there's not really a lot of conversation around, well, how do we figure out what laws are just and unjust? And how do we figure out in the moment, am I going to obey this law or not? And I would love to see it just become normal for, oh yeah, that's a conversation that Christians have all the time.
Yeah. I know I've run up against that at times with well-meaning white Christians who are like, well, we need to obey the laws. And it's like, well, no. We need to follow justice. We need to follow Jesus. And that doesn't necessarily mean obeying the laws if the laws are unjust. But yeah, I wish we had those conversations more. And I think there are pockets in which we have those conversations. But to have them on part of faith formation, right? There's so many rich stories in the Bible, thinking of like Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives who saved Moses' life by breaking the law. We could do a lot better.
I also spend a lot of time thinking about this, he ought to die because he is claimed to be the Son of God. My favorite theologian is Kosuke Koyama, who is a Japanese Christian theologian. His big argument is nobody gave a crap that he said he was the Son of God. This is a period in history where everybody's running around like, oh yeah, I'm the chosen one, I'm the Messiah. It was just a feature of the culture. Jesus' problem was that he kept trying to preach a message of expansive salvation and inclusion. And that expansive salvation and inclusion, the only barrier to getting in is being on the wrong side of that power dynamic. Or not using your power for the sake of justice. That's what made everybody want to kill him. And that's a scenario that no matter what time we're living in, we know what that looks like, right? We have people in our own culture who are just too radical in their love, that are too radical in their justice. And it makes us want to kill him. And so I tend to agree with him that that was Jesus' actual problem. Nobody cared that he said he was the Son of God.
Yeah. And there's the aspect of all people being God's children. There's the title Son of God, but there's also the reality of the creation stories where God is the one who breathes life into humanity. And so the nuance and we're going to use this particular aspect of this one thing in a way that's totally unintended so that we can condemn this person instead of admitting to what we actually are upset about.
Our next gospel passage is John 19, verses 8 through 16a. Pilate, now afraid for his own power and still baffled, questions Jesus a little more and tries to release him, but eventually sends him to be crucified.
So one of the themes in this passage that I kind of hinted at a couple passages ago was the idea of precarious power, that Pilate is in this place where his power is precarious, where it could go either way. He could remain solidly in power, or if he doesn't handle this crisis, this situation well, either there's an insurrection or Rome gets mad and is like, what are you doing? You're done. And it reminded me of in Battlestar Galactica, at one point they settle on New Caprica, this planet, and it's right after Gaius Baltar was elected as president. And then the Cylons come and take over, and Baltar is still president, but very precariously so. And Gaeta works for him, and in different ways, each of them do subvert their power in resistance work. Baltar decidedly tries to not sign execution orders, but Gaeta shares information with the resistance, and so their resistance is not similar to Pilate, right? But that precariousness of how to maintain enough power to keep going and to keep your position while also trying to find a way to balance so that you don't lose it from either angle.
Yeah. I think science fiction in general tends to do a really good job of understanding the insidious power of middle management. I think in all of sort of the best, science fiction movies and books, there's always that person that because I spent a lot of time working and volunteering in prisons, I always think of them as the assistant warden, because very often the most evil person in the prison system is the assistant warden, because they desperately want to be warden and will do anything to be warden. But, whatever the scenario is, I think the best science fiction always has that character or characters who have enough power that they could stop a ball that's rolling down the hill, but they also are just so desperately lusting after more power that becomes their god.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think sometimes we get the opposite of it, right? The people who then are able to make the right decisions in ways that could potentially inspire other people to make the right decisions in non-science fiction real life. But yeah, I think science fiction is one of the best forms of fiction for teaching us about power.
Yeah.
Because there's enough that is made foreign about it that it's a little bit safer for people with power to analyze or to like think critically about. Maybe there's enough distance that it's not quite as personal, so we can like think critically and then get to the point where it's like, oh, and so then what does this have to do with my life? Where do I fall in this? Kind of like what you were saying of like, who are we in this story?
Yeah. I think one of the best examples of that would be McGonagall in the Harry Potter
Yes.
world. She never wanted Dumbledore's job, which is why she was the best person for Dumbledore's job, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And when she does have the power, she tries to protect Harry from Umbridge and in ways that still like navigate that space, but are like, please don't get yourself in trouble with the ministry representative who hates you.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. I guess I was always kind of surprised that she wasn't better at being sneakier. She strikes me as the kind of person that should have been good at that. But, I mean, when you're a woman with that kind of ability and intelligence and all that, that tends to just be something that you pick up along the way. But, of course, you know, in the wizarding world, there is no misogyny, so that's not a problem.
I was born without the ability to engage in any sort of subterfuge. Like, I'm sure part of that is my autism, but, like, I can't be anybody other than who I am for more than, like, 3 minutes at a time. I can't. Like, I am who I am. I say what I think. Even when, like, there's part of my brain that's like, just shut up. Like, you saying this thing is going to have very negative consequences for your life, even if you think it's true. And, like, I can't zip my lip. There are definitely times where I wish that I had the ability to be sneaky.
It does come in handy now and then. On the other hand, I will occasionally say that one of the many reasons it's delightful that I am married to my husband is that he's a terrible liar. So that occasionally comes in handy. It can be useful, but there's also some issues with it.
Yeah.
In verse 11, we see Jesus answered Pilate, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." So it sounds like Jesus is answering the question, which is the greater sin, betrayal or allowing injustice to happen by doing your job, basically. And he's saying, I mean, really, they're the same thing. Just allowing injustice to happen, that is betrayal, I think. And it reminds me of in Star Wars when Obi-Wan Kenobi asks, who is the greater fool, the fool or the fool who follows him? Which one is the greater? Is it Pilate or is it the one who put Pilate in this position? It really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I was thinking, when you were saying that, I was thinking about, so I was arrested last June as part of a protest, and when we were like waiting to be let out for, you know, however many hours that it was, but we were processed, and it was just like, now sit and wait here for a couple more hours because we can. And there were like 1 or 2 officers who came by and were like trying to talk to us, and were like, yeah, sorry this happened to you. And we were like, and they had this like, but there are like good police too, like us. And I was like, if you weren't here, they wouldn't be able to arrest us, even if they were trying to like do the right thing or be the good cops. Because the system was corrupt and because of how it was working, they were supporting the police that were pepper spraying and arresting and all of that stuff.
And for that matter, they were perfectly free to, at the very least, stand up and say, these charges are bogus, and I will tell any journalist or any judge that asks that that's true. And I'm guessing they didn't.
They did not.
I think one of my roles in the church that I didn't ask for, God, thank you very much, is helping people identify their own motivations. And a lot of people get real mad when you help them do that. But, you know, for good or for ill, I do think one of my roles in the church is to, you know, just sort of basically say, like, you're going to do what you're going to do, fam. Like, I don't have enough systemic power to stop you, but I'm going to make sure you're clear on why you're doing what you're doing. I'm not going to allow you to lie to yourself.
Yeah. I think you do, Jessica, on a like one-on-one level, what different civil rights leaders, right, like Alexei Navalny right now in Russia, or Nelson Mandela, King, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, each of them did in like when they are arrested, that is on a larger scale, on a big picture scale, saying like, what is your motivation? Why are you doing the things that you're doing? This is like a clear, I am doing the things that I am doing for a particular reason, and I am willing to face arrest or break out and after getting arrested, right? Like, I'm willing to face those consequences. I have a clarity of purpose. And so you need to be clear about what your purpose is and what purpose you serve in this struggle.
Yeah.
That was like, it feels connected to me. I don't know if it feels connected to you, Jessica, but
Yeah, I think so.
that's part of this dynamic of Pilate, like trying to release Jesus, but also being told in no uncertain terms, like, if you release Jesus, you're not a friend of the emperor. And so then it's like, okay, what is Pilate's motivation? Keeping his position within the empire.
Yeah.
Our next reading is John chapter 19, verses 16b through 22. Jesus is crucified at Golgotha between two others. Pilate instructs that the inscription above him read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. As is evident, I love Emperor in the Ashes, and so the theme of inscriptions came up for me, and there's...
If they had inscriptions on limbus bread, I'm sure you would have gone there instead.
I definitely would have gone there if it were limbus bread inscriptions. There's an inscription on Black Cliff Tower, the tower at the military academy in Emperor in the Ashes, that talks about the foretelling and the foretold emperor and who it will be. And there's a way in which that inscription appears clear, and then through the course of the 4 books, like, there's new ways of understanding it and new ways, and it's not until the end that we really understand. But I think that's part of what Pilate is doing with the inscription, right? There's a way to understand this inscription in the many languages that it is written, that says Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, and different people interpret it differently and have different reactions to it. Because it is a very, like, God is king, right? Like, that is part of Jewish theology and part of Christian theology, for that matter, or one of the names, I guess, that Christians can use for God. And so Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, has a meaning and then has, like, other meanings as well and can be interpreted differently.
One of the things that's on my list of, like, things I'm going to do when I have free time, is I want to go back and get another master's, and it would be in the history of memory. And what made me want to do that was that when I was an undergrad and working on a degree in Holocaust and genocide studies, I spent a couple of months studying in the concentration camps in Germany and Eastern Europe. And I had this moment when I was at the Majdanek camp and the memorial they have there, where I suddenly realized that within a second of seeing a memorial, I could tell who built the memorial and who was paying for the memorial. Whether it was the Russians or the Poles or the Germans. In some cases, there's a lot of U.S. money behind those memorials. And those are the places where it feels more like an amusement park than a memorial.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it flipped a switch in me where I became sort of obsessed with figuring out who gets to tell the story and what societal mechanisms do we use to declare this is the story that's getting told, the version of the story. And that architecture often plays a huge part in that. Like, that's often one of those mechanisms.
Yeah. I remember between college and seminary, I spent a year in Slovakia with the Young Adults in Global Missions program in the ELCA. And when I was coming back, my dad came and joined me for like the last week at my placement. And then we spent about a week and a half, 2 weeks in Germany, and we did like a Martin Luther Holocaust tour of Germany, traveled throughout Germany and saw different sites that were important to Martin Luther's life, and then also visited multiple of the concentration camps and memorials. And I remember one of the places, I don't remember which place it is. I want to say Buchenwald or Birkenau. I don't remember which one, but there was this memorial that there were like several memorials set up, and one was the Never Again one that our tour guide brought us to, and then said, this one I always end with because this is a lie. Mm-hmm. Genocide is still happening. like holocausts are happening in other places in the world. But the other piece of that, one of the other memorials there was really powerful, and it had the different symbols that Nazis used to identify people. So it had like the yellow Star of David, but it had the different triangles all in this one work of art. And there were two triangles missing. One was the pink triangle, and then one was, I think, brown, the one that represented Jehovah's Witnesses, I think. And it's because that memorial was paid for by the Catholic Church. And so that story didn't get told. And I think about, like, I was doing that trip right after spending a year with Roma in Slovakia, who a large percentage of Roma were killed, and in ways that, like, we don't have accurate information because they weren't categorized always as Roma. Sometimes they were categorized as criminals or like the stereotypes that we have of Roma. And so seeing those different pieces and knowing that, like, the phrase that I learned growing up was 6 million Jewish people died in the Holocaust. I didn't learn 11 million people were systematically targeted and killed in the Holocaust, and among them, over half were Jewish people, and also Roma, and gay people, and trans people, and Jehovah's Witnesses, and, like,
disabled people, and so on.
And I just, like, the phrasing that we use, right? It's that, how do we tell history? How do we remember things? And what phrasing do we use? Do we use the active voice or the passive voice? Are people killed? Do people die? Are people systematically targeted and killed? I want you to get this master's degree, Jessica, because I am fascinated by it and would be so grateful to have your insights and wisdom in that particular area.
The shame is that, like, the list of things I'll do when I have free time someday just gets ever longer.
Yeah. That was part of both, I think, for both Kay and I laughing when you said, when I have free time. I know you, and I know me, and I know, like, the concept of time.
In the New Jerusalem, great. We'll all have extra grad degrees then.
I often talk about, like, the books I plan to write before the eschaton.
As far as I'm aware, you could also write them after. That works, whatever.
Yeah.
In verse 17, when we read that carrying the cross by himself, Jesus went out. I guess each year different pieces stick out to me in the Passion story, and this piece of, like, carrying the cross by himself, and even though in many ways he's, like, in the midst of crowds, but there's just this loneliness and aloneness of this verse, and it reminded me of Laia in the Ember and the Ashes series. After she sees the truth about her mom and what happened when her mom and her dad and her sister were captured and imprisoned and tortured, and she sees this truth that just, like, rocks her and is in so many ways unbearable for her, and she is left all alone. Like, the purpose of this memory being revealed to her is to crush her spirit, to crush her heart, and just that loneliness that she feels in that moment of feeling abandoned and without use and without all of those things. I can't imagine that particular loneliness.
In verse 18, we read, "There they crucified him." So my first thought for this one is sort of both a reference and a content warning. If you played a video game called Fallout New Vegas, which was hugely popular when it first came out and is also having a bit of a resurgence right now because it's both cheap and works on older computers, one of the consistent things that happens throughout the game is that people are crucified on actual crosses. One of the civilizations in the game uses that as the same, they are modeling themselves after the Roman Empire, and so they use crucifixion in the same way the Roman Empire did to punish and make an example and humiliate. And so that's a plot point that comes up several times throughout the game. And I have not personally played the game, but I've spoken to others who have, and apparently they do a fairly decent job of conveying the seriousness and how horrible of a death it is. Our next gospel passage is John 19, verses 23 through 30. The attending Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' clothing. Jesus told the man he loved and his mother to be family together, and then Mary and the other women witnessed her son's death.
So one of the themes in this passage is the fulfillment of Scripture, right? It's casting lot for Jesus' clothing, dividing clothing among them. And it reminded me of like the cherry picking of scriptures that happens frequently by Christians, especially John and Matthew, I think, are the two that I notice it most with, where they have something and they're like, to fulfill all the scripture. And I frequently, when talking about like relationships and that sort of thing and queerness, talk about my best friend who is also my college roommate and my ex. And so when I'm talking about her and our relationship, I was like, yeah. And then I dated, in my first year of college, I dated my college roommate to fulfill all stereotypes. But it's one of those things, and I'm like, yep, that's to fulfill all stereotypes. Dating my college roommate, and we're still friends. Not quite the same as fulfilling all scripture, but, you know, we're working on it.
I think my reaction to stuff like that in John and particularly in Matthew is just to sort of be like, oh, John, you know. And I think it's a shorthand for myself and a lot of colleagues who have this sort of the same relationship to prophecy that I do. But it's probably to our detriment that we don't spend more time fleshing that out and talking about it. I would love to say that like prophecy is easy to categorize, but it just isn't. And you know, the prophecy we see in scripture is so complex and multi-layered that I think all we can really say about it that would sort of apply across the board is that it's telling God's truth to people, you know, through a vehicle that happens to be, you know, another person. Sometimes it's like a fortune-telling kind of thing that, you know, we often think of prophecy as, but many times it's not. Many times it's just sort of functioning as that mirror. And so I am not overly concerned with the fortune-telling aspect or the, like, you know, sort of predicting the future aspect of like, oh, this thing that Jesus said or did was predicted already. I am very concerned with resonances in the text. I think it's critically important that Christians know their Hebrew scriptures because, I mean, there's no way that you can go more than, you know, a paragraph in the Christian scriptures without a reference to the Hebrew scriptures. So I think it's really important for us to hear the resonances, but I also really, really caution us from being like, oh, look, this thing was predicted. And, you know, that can take us down a really dangerous path.
Yeah. That's part of why I love Amy Jill Levine, who's a Jewish New Testament scholar.
Yes.
And she does such a great job of giving Jewish context, giving Hebrew Bible context, and also resisting the places where Christian supersessionism comes in and saying, like, this wasn't actually the case, but this is how this author is interpreting it, or those sorts of things.
And it's going to sound kind of mean, but I'm not particularly concerned with biblical interpretations of the Christian scriptures from people who haven't put in the work to know the Hebrew scriptures. And I'm not applying that to, you know, the average member of a congregation who's just having a conversation about like, oh, this is what I think about it. But I think, you know, if it's someone who's trying to speak with a voice of authority and tell other people what to believe, if you don't know your Hebrew scriptures, like, I don't want to hear it, bud. Like, you have no authority for me.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but I often find myself telling folks that are members of vulnerable communities, especially queer folks and people of color, you have to learn a little bit of Hebrew and Greek. Like, it's not fair. Like, you don't want to be a pastor. Like, you're just living your life. But people are going to lie to you so consistently about what the Bible says that if you don't have at least a little bit of tools to look it up for yourself, you're never going to know what this scripture is saying about you. And I that's not a conversation that I should have to have all the time, but it is.
Yeah. I also have that particularly with queer people of, like, I think a lot of the times it's that they're coming to me because I have done that research, but it's like the words in English don't mean what, like the English words are not the same. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about how Muslims speak about the Quran is only in Arabic.
Yeah.
Everything else is an interpretation of the Quran in English or in whatever language. And it's just like that clarity, that translation is never going to be exact, I think is really helpful.
Judaism and Islam both have that down, and both encourage learning the language, and Christianity is the one of the people of the book that don't.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
On a lighter note, in verse 25, we hear, "Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene." So Mary's sister was also named Mary. You can read this, that Mary, the wife of Clopas, is Mary, the mother of Jesus' sister. You can also read this as there are 4 women standing there, and there's Jesus' mom and his aunt, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. But where's the fun in that, I ask?
And it's been a while since I've had the Greek in front of me, but I don't actually think that's what it says. Only because I did do an entire, 2-semester John thing where it was mostly in Greek, and we spent several weeks reading these passages. So I've had it in front of me multiple times. I think it's Mary and her sister, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene.
This is a wonderful example of the dangers of translation and interpretation. Absolutely.
Yeah, where you decide to put that comma that was not, in the original text is going to totally change the meaning. I'm actually teaching a Bible 101 course online right now, and we just had our first session this past week. And one of the things, I really kept harping on is none of the punctuation was originally in there. The chapters and verses, the stupid section headings, they're just suggestions. And if it's a place where it affects the meaning of the text, you have to remember they're just suggestions, and sometimes they're dumb suggestions.
Yes.
And that can be really hard. If you've been reading the Bible in English your whole life and you've been seeing chapters and verses and commas and periods, to get out of thinking that these are in some way authoritative.
Yeah, I love blowing confirmation students' minds with the idea that Greeks really did not believe in commas. Technically speaking, I think they had them, but they only get used when you're reading the New Testament. You might see 1 comma every 3 pages. They're really not common at all. And so the vast majority of commas that we've thrown in there are just thrown in there, and it can really mess with what the text means. For example, that comma there being used instead of another "and" means that I immediately thought of the old Nick at Night TV reference for this would be from the Newhart show, not the Newhart show, but Newhart, the show, I guess, with, "Hi, I'm Larry, this is my brother Daryl, and this is my other brother Daryl." This is probably not what was going on. Mary's sister was probably not named Mary. Of course, Mary is a hugely common name, but probably not that common. I do, however, wonder if there is a less dated reference that would also make sense. Has anybody else made that joke since Newhart did, of siblings having the same name?
None are popping immediately to mind, but I do definitely know folks who have children with the same names, or usually they're spelled differently.
Sure.
And it's almost in almost every case it's pointing to something that's really important in their family story. And it's just making me think of how incredibly important names are in Scripture. And for those who might not be familiar, often characters are named in ways in Scripture that tell you about them. And I think Mary, Miriam, is one of those examples. And I often wonder if it's to our benefit that we translate people's names in Scripture. I preached a sermon one time where I was talking about, how important names are and asking folks about their own names. And, I talked about the fact that this person we call Jesus was named Yehoshua. And after the service, this wonderful little old woman comes up to me and she's like, "I want to tell all my friends what you said. Now, what did you say Jesus' name was? Was it Yolanda?" And I so wanted to say yes. I so want that to be canon, that Jesus' name was Yolanda. But because, Jesus' name, Yehoshua, actually means God is our salvation, I sort of feel like if we're gonna translate the names, why don't we translate them what they mean, right? It's not fair to expect people who don't speak Hebrew or Greek to be able to come to these texts and know what the text is saying about the person just by reading their name.
Yeah. And I think, Mary especially, the name Mary, right, means there are a few different meanings, among them bitter, beloved, and rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge piece of it, right? There's a reason why everybody, all of the women are named Mary.
Yeah.
And it's because it was a way of naming resistance to the Roman occupation without the Roman occupation being able to, do anything about it. So all the little girls are running around named Mary.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really even matter if they were named Mary in real life or not. Like, the text is telling you that that's who they are.
Right.
Yeah. They are rebellion. They are bitter. Yeah. They are beloved. I was looking at that part of the passage and was struck by the ways that Jesus is creating new and chosen family, right? Mm-hmm. He matches up the beloved disciple, the one that he loves, the disciple he loves most, with his mom, and saying, you are family now because you have been family to me, and now you are family to each other. And it reminded me of in X-Men, and this happened in X-Men First Class, is I think where we see it most clearly, but Raven, who becomes Mystique, becomes family with Xavier, Professor X, when they're younger. And there's like complications and paternalism and all sorts of like problematic things, but that way of like, she's starving and in need of food, and so sneaking into his kitchen to get food, and he figures out what's going on, and he says, you never need to worry about food again. And it is this, like, you will be my family, and I will be your family, and we will care for each other. And I love particularly the queerness of chosen family.
Yeah.
And the ways that we create chosen family together.
Yeah. Yeah, denying people's right to chosen family is one of the things the church does that makes zero sense to me. Like, we do terrible things, but, like, most of the time I'm at least able to say, oh, well, they chose this verse. But, like, nowhere in Scripture does it say you can only define family in this one way. Like, and because Scripture covers such a huge period of time, we see people's concepts of what families are go through these massive shifts, all throughout the text. And then we have Jesus, like, literally being like, this is what family is. And multiple times Jesus talks about, how you figure out what family is. And so it just mystifies me that as, in the church, that we would take such a hard line and say, oh no, family means this specific thing. And it's not even really related to anything that's happening in the Bible.
Yeah. For that matter, the number of people I meet who believe that the Bible teaches that your family has to be good and respectable in order for you to be, good and respectable or whatever. And I guest preached at a congregation once that was using the narrative lectionary, and it was the Sunday after Christmas, and the text chosen was Jesus' genealogy. Mm. I don't actually remember if it was the Joseph one or the Mary one, whatever, but the one that's, given to Joseph, because it doesn't quite work on the other side. But the list of Jesus' genealogy is a list of deeply flawed and mostly very screwed up people. And so the sermon was essentially, it does not matter how screwed up your family is. Jesus gets it. Look at this family tree. And the number of people who were just completely blown away by that was amazing to me, because I grew up with the concept of the Bible is not filled with perfect people, it's filled with deeply flawed people. And a lot of people did not grow up with that.
Yeah. One time I was doing pulpit supply for a congregation, and Pentecost was the same weekend as Pride Sunday, or Ooh. Pride weekend, which is super exciting. And if you're ever going to have a queer pastor preach on Pride weekend, you better know what you're in for. But particularly like on Pentecost. And It was at a congregation whose welcoming statement said, we welcome people of all sexual orientations and gender identifications. So they were a little bit off, and I knew it, but yeah. I preached an amazing sermon that like somebody messed up and it didn't get recorded, which I was just like so not happy about that. But it was about that church family, like that church is queer chosen family. That is like so much of who, like, there is no way for me to understand church without understanding it as queer family. And it was just like those connections that like I don't understand how like church is not queer chosen family, like that it doesn't compute for me to me for it to be something other than queer. Not everybody was particularly happy, I think mostly because that was a sermon not about including queer people, but like rooted in queer theology, and that was like a new thing for them.
Yeah.
But our final passage for this episode is John chapter 19, verses 31 through 42. Jesus is already dead, so his legs are not broken, though his body is stabbed, just to be sure. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus arrange for Jesus' burial nearby. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of secret followers, right? So we hear that Joseph of Arimathea was a secret follower of Jesus, and Nicodemus also came to Jesus at night, and presumably in secret. I was thinking about in the book Divergent, which is one of my next to read, so it's on my mind, and Tori is the person who does Triss's tattoo and also who does Triss's test for divergence. But Tori is in many ways a secret support for Triss, the protagonist, throughout the books for like reasons we learn about later, but she is a person who does support Triss. And I think it's interesting because a lot of the time I get frustrated by the like, oh, we'll support you in secret but not in public. Mm-hmm. And also I think there is an important role for people who are supports, not necessarily super in secret, but like in private, that not every support needs to be a very public, very big thing. I think it's a little complicated and like there's definite room for nuance, but I'm not quite as all support should be totally public as I used to be. Mm-hmm. Also, I might have had a crush on one or both of those characters.
I can see that. I have always had an interest and a particular relationship with how Jesus's body is treated. I think even, from the time I was a little kid, I remember, one, just because of sort of my life situation, being fairly certain that I would die before I ever saw, 18 or 20 or anything. But also just really being interested in how we treat bodies and what that says about, how we do community. And my first nursing job was in pediatric oncology. And, unfortunate as it is, a lot of our patients die. And a big part of our work is helping people die. Mm-hmm. And because on our unit we had patients from all over the world, I became really invested in learning their death practices and making sure that their death practices could be followed in a way that, like, it didn't have to become the parent's problem. Like, your child has just died. I will take care of it, and I will make sure that it's taken care of in accordance to your death practices and not need to ask you a bunch of questions. Like, I've already done the research. I know how to handle it. And the ways in which that felt really like ministry to me. And how holy it is to be, like, involved in preparing someone's body. Yeah. That's definitely not something I expected, not a direction I expected my life to take. But that's something that ended up being really, really important to me. And so I often wonder about, the characters in Scripture that had a role in preparing Jesus's body, in particular the women.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about that too in my hospital chaplaincy work of how do we say goodbye. Like, it's especially when it's a situation like Jesus's where there's like a question of criminal like those sorts of things, and medical examiners frequently say like you can't touch the body because we have to figure out what exactly happened. Yeah. And I couldn't imagine doing it with Jesus' body in particular because so much trauma happened to his body right before he died. But those are the hardest ones because it's so much about, even if it takes like hours before someone's ready, especially for a kid to touch or hold the kid's body, that has like, there's just such a big impact of like being able to do that, and to not be able to hold or touch is just so hard.
Yeah. And thankfully, the hospital that I worked at was really good about understanding how important that was. And so, like, no matter how busy you were, somehow when one of your patients died, the rest of the nurses just, like, magically took over all of the rest of your patients. So that if you needed to spend 3 hours getting that body ready, that's fine. It took 3 hours. And if you needed another 2 hours to be there with the family while they held their child, that's fine. We got you. We'll handle it. That part of it is holy to me, too. Yeah. I think, too, we've been talking a lot about how police violence shows up here in the U.S. The fact that so often when the police kill a person of color or an indigenous person and their body is left in the street for everybody to watch for hours, sometimes days, that's not an accident. That is a very clear message about the lack of importance of our bodies in this country's story. It's a very intentional and clear message to the people watching. Like, this is how little your body matters to us. Yeah.
Yeah. In verse 39, we hear that Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. Come to think of it, I'm actually pretty sure that preparing a dead body for burial was, generally speaking, a woman's job in ancient Palestine. So the fact that it's Nicodemus who shows up with this is a little unusual. Although now Emily has given me the mental image of Nicodemus as a ninja Christian, as the secret follower of Jesus, sneaking around behind the scenes. And
I was hoping more along the lines of like trans or genderqueer, but ninja works.
Both and. The rule for improv, which basically this is yes and. Yes, Nicodemus can totally be a genderqueer Christian ninja. Absolutely. So I got a little distracted by that when we were on our way toward this verse. But that wasn't where I was originally going when I was originally reading the text. When I originally was reading the text, I was thinking about 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes. That's a lot. And we don't have the context, especially given the way that modern American culture separates the vast majority of people from death practices in funeral homes and so forth. We don't really have the background to realize that, it probably would have taken that much to prepare Jesus for burial because of the amount that has to be applied to the body in order to preserve is not quite the correct word, but allow the body to not decay in the uglier ways. And so, given the average height and weight back then, this would probably be maybe a little less, maybe about as much as Jesus would have weighed in myrrh and aloes, and that would have been applied to the body several times over and over again as his body was prepared. And this served a similar purpose to the preservative process that dead bodies, which are buried these days, generally go in funeral homes. But now I have this very macabre reference in my head, because when I think of someone using a massive amount of moisturizer or lotion, the reference that comes to mind for me is from the British TV show Coupling, which was the source material, essentially, for the popular American TV show Friends. Friends was definitely based on Coupling. It is really obvious if you watch both shows, but they never officially gave any kind of recognition, because why would they do that when they could make more money by not having to pay British people? And in the British show, there was this running joke about one of the characters used a truly vast amount of moisturizer on a daily basis. It started as just you would constantly see her, like in almost every scene, she would be applying lotion to some piece of her body. But then it kept increasing as the show went on, to the point where by the end of the run, after a few years, she was apparently applying multiple full-size bottles of lotion a day. And and you only ever saw, bits and pieces of it, but it was just a constant thing. And that's what came to mind.
I think I might be that person, not for myself, but for Black children. Like, I always had, wherever I am, I have a reputation for being the person that's like, don't let these white people see you out in the street with ashy elbows thinking I don't take care of you. You better put some lotion on before you go in front of those white people. And, it's not a cultural thing that is super great. The degree to which we always have to be aware of how white people are judging our appearance. But it definitely is a thing. And, like, moisturizer as love is definitely a thing for the Black community. Like, that's part of how you show that you love someone, is by, like, keeping their skin healthy.
That makes sense to me. But, yeah, especially because there are so many products that are not made for Black skin or Black hair that, like, being really intentional about caring for those.
Vaseline has been trying to capitalize on that recently with their ads that are geared towards Black and Latin people. They're doing a very poor job of it, but it's funny to watch the ads. That, like, they get that, like, moisturizing your skin is really important to us, and they're trying. But you can also tell that only white people wrote the script for this commercial.
When I was looking at this in verse 40 in particular, of talking about how they cared for Jesus' body, I was thinking more in lines with what you were talking about, Jessica, of like the different ways different cultures care for bodies when someone dies. And in the Divergent series, Triss ends up like sacrificing herself, which I despise, because we need to stop killing strong women in fiction.
I think you actually already said that in this episode. But
a lot. Anyway,
yeah.
Probably. It's very important to me to stop killing
that's fair.
strong women. both in reality and in fiction. She is cremated and her ashes are spread in a very dauntless way. And for the first time ever in his life, actually does the zip line from the top of one of the Chicago skyscrapers and just like lets her ashes trail out. He's terrified of heights. And so this is like a big deal for him to actually do this, but also is such a faithful and loving thing to do for Tris, whom he loved. Yeah. With her body.
I think I just really want for us to understand the fact that Jesus' story continues with his dead body. And I think because we live in a culture that is so removed from death and so removed from what, happens to people after they die, that it can be easy to kind of just read these verses and be like, oh, well, that doesn't apply to us anymore. It does. I mean, someone is doing that work that Nicodemus was doing. And so, yeah, I would love to have us get better at connecting to those parts of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. I think especially as we're recording this, we're recording up ahead of time. And in this country, we just hit 500,000 deaths due to COVID. 500,000 COVID deaths. Certainly more than that due to COVID and the ways that it impacted other health concerns. And there's an article that I just recently read and I think shared on my blog, but about the people who work in funeral homes and who do that work of preparing bodies and the impact that it's had on them during COVID, both as like an increased demand, but also the dangers and the risks of dealing with dead bodies who have died of a disease that we don't fully understand. And when they've gotten COVID, what has happened.
And speaking of fictional portrayals, when we have morticians and people who do that work show up in fiction, maybe we could stop constantly portraying them as deeply creepy people.
Yeah.
There was a funeral home director, retired funeral home director in one of the congregations I served. He was one of the most faithful people, and like their daughter had been ordained as a pastor, and she actually died really young. But the work that funeral home directors and people who work in funeral homes do is such holy work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the small town funeral directors or rural funeral directors that I've worked with have been some of the best people I've ever met.
Mm-hmm. Same here.
Yeah. Also, generally really hilarious. Best senses of humor I have ever seen. Yeah.
I've had so many funerals where I had to be like, stop, the family is coming. Because they have the ability to turn it on and off like a switch, and I don't. So I'm going to be the one that's caught out laughing. Like, stop.
So, Jess, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Gosh, I think it probably is the COVID piece because, it's been in the back of my mind the whole time we've been talking. We're talking about Jesus and Jesus' death and death in general, and like we haven't mentioned it. And I kept sort of like waiting for a place that it made sense in the conversation, but like I didn't really want to talk about it. I think that, at least just speaking for myself, I'm spending so much time on phone calls and Zooms with people who are actively dying and with family members of people who are dying. And it's easy to just sort of like compartmentalize it and, put it in a little box in the corner. But at some point, we're all going to have to deal with it, that we are still living in the middle of a pandemic. No matter how much we want to pretend like it's not happening. Yeah. And I think that the way that we as a culture, the way that us in the church are handling it, by not naming the enormity of the grief, by not really doing anything to memorialize the dead in a communal way, I think is to our detriment, and it's going to be to our detriment for a very, very long time. I think that, we have to get better at naming sin and death and grief, and the ways in which death and grief are the consequences of sin. And I think, those of us who are leaders in the church, like, if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it on our behalf. Yeah. I think even, I'm always reminding people that, like, we want to talk about these unprecedented times. What makes these times unprecedented is that white people are dying, right? Like, the same number of people die of malaria every year. Many, many times more people die of hunger every year. But they're Black and brown people, so, whatever. Yeah. So I hope that this experience, like, doesn't make us more insular and more like, oh, if we don't talk about it, it's not happening. I hope that this experience can cause us to be looking outward and thinking like, it's so horrible that this happened here. Maybe we should be spending some time and energy and money in the places where this happens every year. So that's all I got.
Yeah, I think that is a really powerful wish and hope for us as a culture and for us as communities of faith. I think about the ways that in Iowa we've been trying to do that, and it's hard. It is hard to name the grief, but it's harder, especially in the long run, to not name the grief and the pain and the death. And there are people who hold significant responsibility for this. Yeah, we're planning an event that has been postponed multiple times because of a polar vortex, but is geared towards both the naming of grief and the naming of responsibility that will hopefully have taken place by the time this episode airs. Well, thanks for being with us, Jessica.
Yes.
And thanks for joining us, listeners. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Easter Sunday. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.